Hello and welcome to this BBC News special. I'm Reeta Chakrabarti in Downing Street, and this is the scene here in Westminster, where all afternoon speculation has been growing that the Prime Minister is about to make some sort of announcement, possibly concerning a general election. Earlier, our political editor Chris Mason observed that he was seeing behaviour from the likes of the civil service that you, quote, would only expect on the day that an election is called. And he also reports that Home Office ministers' diaries are being cleared. Well, you won't necessarily be able to see this, but there are about 150 journalists here, all waiting expectantly. I stress we don't yet know whether an announcement will be made, but certainly that speculation has been growing all day and has reached a pitch this afternoon. I'm happy to say that I am joined now by our political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, what do we know?
It looks likely we're going to hear from the Prime Minister relatively soon, and he will tell us that Parliament will be dissolved and that there will be a general election this summer, perhaps at the beginning of July. So we've had a day where, as you were just mentioning, there's been elements of choreography slotting into place where every element could have had a plausible alternative explanation. Cabinet meetings happen every week, usually on a Tuesday rather than a Wednesday, but it was cancelled yesterday because the Prime Minister was abroad. Lots of civil servants saying they were encountering bizarre behaviour from officials in Downing Street, not communicating with them in the way that they would normally expect. And slowly but slowly, the building blocks of a likely announcement started to take place. Now sources emphasising privately that we are probably not many minutes away from that confirmation, after lots of discussions in the heart of government going on for some time about when to go for a general election. It's a quirk, isn't it, of the British electoral system that the power lies with the Prime Minister to pick the date up to a legal backstop beyond which they cannot go. That is at the tail end of January next year. But a Prime Minister holds the power of surprise, and this will be and is going to be a surprise to some. I was going to
say, Chris, because you're very close to this and you've been watching the build-up, but for many people out there, they will be switching the TV on, listening in and wondering, well, where did this come from? Why is he doing it today? You can't see into his mind, but why?
And not only will there be people turning on and asking themselves that question, there are people in this postcode, there are people in this government who themselves are asking that very question, because the indications had been from very senior figures until very recently that it was much more likely to be in the autumn, because the Prime Minister could allow it to happen then. He would be able to guarantee a certain period of time in government before that encounter with the electorate, with an outcome that from his perspective looks shaky as things stand when you look at the opinion polls. Also perhaps a chance for the economy to improve a little further. But there's been others very close to him who have been saying, look, there is a desire out there for a chance to have a say, and if you are seen to put that off, that might make it worse for us. And when they say us, they mean the Conservative Party. So there have been those saying just that in his ear. There are also those around the Prime Minister who've been looking at some of the news of recent weeks. Take, for instance, the inflation news that we were reporting from 7 o'clock this morning. That inflation target, the rate of rises of prices, coming very close to the government's target, down from 11% when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. There's other economic indicators are beginning to look a little better, although lots of people watching us now will say, hang on a minute, things still do feel pretty difficult. And the Prime Minister acknowledged that this morning. They have got their flagship Rwanda legislation into law, that idea of sending some migrants to East Africa to try, they hope, and put off people attempting small boat crossings. That hasn't happened yet. That hasn't happened yet. From their perspective, they'd be able to go into the campaign saying that is a clear dividing line with Labour, who have argued that they would stop those flights as quickly as they could if they were to win the general election. And also, with those flights not having gone, the argument, which is not yet proven, that that scheme would prove to be a deterrent has not yet been tested. And were it not to prove to be a deterrent, then from the Conservative perspective, maybe it's best that that becomes an argument you make rather than critics potentially being able to point to evidence of the opposite, were that to be the case. Also, what else might have been playing in the minds of people in government tempted to go? Now, it's back to where we started. It's the surprise factor. We've had various moments this year, this calendar year, of speculation. I've been pretty relaxed when my phone has been ringing off the hook at every point prior to today, because it was very easy to establish that it was rubbish, because I would speak to various folk in there and elsewhere and it would be quickly established that no, it wasn't going to happen. What was different today, in fact from last night onwards, is that just wasn't happening, and I could tell that this just felt different, that the conversation, the balance of debate within that building had tilted, had shifted towards wanting to go sooner rather than later. And as I say, there's a surprise element there, because only those in there, a handful of people around the Prime Minister, would know and can make a decision. And for everyone else in government, but most crucially from their perspective in the opposition parties, is guessing and back-timing all of their plans to various theoretical, hypothetical dates, not knowing when you might want to have that manifesto of promises just ready to go. Whether it's a good idea to do a big announcement this week when maybe there's an election announcement coming, or not, because maybe we've got months yet to go. So it has the power of surprise, and it would seem that on that side of the ledger, surprise and where they perceive themselves to have got in the 18 plus months of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister has led them to think this is the best chance for them. And so it looks like here we go. An extraordinary few weeks ahead.
It is just worth stating for anybody who happens to be switching on, we are here in Downing Street along with many, many others from media outlets. There is an expectation that the Prime Minister is going to make an announcement, and there has been building all day, but we don't yet know exactly whether there'll be an announcement, and if so, what it's going to be. Chris, I just wanted to ask you, you've talked about the economy with better figures today on inflation. You've talked about his pledge to stop the small boats. Would there be, if he were to call an election now, a sort of weighing up on his part, a sort of thinking this is as good as it's going to get?
Yes, I think that is probably ultimately the human rationale that the Prime Minister is likely to have come to as a conclusion. Why do I say that? For two reasons. One is the unshiftable political truth for the Conservative Party, and indeed for the Labour Party and others right now, which is that the Conservatives have been in government for 14 years, and that becomes very difficult political headwinds for any government to walk into. Ask Labour in 2010, when they've been in power for 13 years. It becomes very difficult. Not necessarily impossible, the decision will be in the hands of the electorate, but it becomes difficult. And we've seen that reflected in opinion polls and in local and by-election results. There's also a psychological point, I think, here, Reeta, for both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. They became Prime Minister and Chancellor as a result of one of the most astonishing moments in contemporary British political history, that incredibly short period as Prime Minister that Liz Truss had. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, will have felt in the summer of 2022 that their political careers in all likelihood were over, were finished. They weren't going to serve in a Liz Truss administration. It was a reasonable expectation at the time that she would serve until a general election, maybe beyond it if she was able to win it. They became Prime Minister and Chancellor, the two most commanding figures in British government, almost not by accident, but by a quirk of history. And I think that has informed their approach to the last couple of years, that desire to steady the ship, both economically and politically, in their view to restore the reputation of the UK on the international stage after a period where, quite bluntly, a lot of people had been laughing at the fragility of British politics, and to attempt to give their party the best possible platform for which to go into an election that was almost always going to be very, very difficult for them. That, looking at the opinion polls and recent election results, is true now, as it almost certainly would have been later in the year. So whilst there might have been a temptation to go longer because that allows more time in government and potentially things to brighten a little further economically, predicting the future is a mug's game, and things might politically for them have felt worse. And so it would seem now a racing certainty that after a intense discussion behind that door involving people of different views and different instincts on what is a fine judgment call, attempting to weigh up a range of factors, many of which are quite difficult to extrapolate into the future, that they have concluded for themselves, yes, but perhaps more broadly they'll make an argument for the country too, that now is the right time for a general election.
Chris, we're going to come back to you very shortly. I'm just going to go and let you check your phone. I'm sure you're getting lots of messages and so on. We'll be back with you very shortly. But for the moment, thank you. That was Chris Mason, of course, our political editor. Let's cross to the newsroom now and speak to Hannah White from the Institute for Government, who's in our newsroom for us. Thank you so much for joining us, Hannah. I'm glad you're in the warm and dry on this rather wet May day. Just talk us through what we are likely to see now should the Prime Minister make the announcement that people are expecting. And I have to stress, we don't still quite know, but what would be the protocol?
So what we would expect is the Prime Minister to come out in maybe the next few minutes, the next hour or so, and make an announcement to say that he is planning, he either has already spoken to the King or he's planning to go to the palace to ask for a dissolution of Parliament in order to hold a general election. Normally what would happen is Parliament would continue to sit for a few days in order to deal with the legislation which is currently going through the House. There's still 16 government bills, which obviously in an ideal world the government would like to see become law, and so there'll be what's called a wash-up, where they talk to the opposition parties and try to speed some of that legislation onto the statute book. Then the expectation would be that if you had a election, people are saying that that would be on the 4th of July, then you would need to have dissolved Parliament by Thursday next week. At that point, all MPs cease to become MPs. They've just become candidates standing for election, and we will be into the general election campaign.
And just to explain, Hannah, why is it the 4th of July that people are talking about?
I think people are talking about the 4th of July just on the basis of when the announcement is being made, the fact that you will need a few days for wash-up for Parliament to conclude its business. And the fact is that if you factor in Thursday next week as being the last day on which Parliament might sit, it's 25 days for an election campaign, 25 working days before the election would then be held. And I think the reasoning people are thinking of is that that would be before at least English schools break up for the holidays, although not Scottish schools. They will have already finished for the summer. But there are obviously lots of different calculations that go into picking an election date, as Chris has been saying.
And Hannah, I don't know if you had an opportunity to listen to Chris Mason, our political editor, who was saying that he listens to people, he reads the runes, and he often dismisses speculation of election talk. But it's simply that people have been responding differently in the last few hours, particularly amongst the civil service. What would change in a civil servant's behaviour if there's an expectation of a general election?
Well, of course, the civil service has to be very careful when they actually get into an election campaign to make sure that nothing they do can be perceived as working on behalf of the government at that point in order to promote the government's interests, because government MPs just become candidates for election at that point. But I think what Chris will have been referring to is examples of meetings being cancelled, some ministers seeming to cut short their international travel. And really, for me, the persuasive thing has been the absence of denial, because we all have examples, and Gordon Brown is the famous one, of prime ministers who allowed speculation about an election being called to run riot, and then didn't call an election. And I think prime ministers are now very cognizant of the fact that they need to shut down that sort of speculation quickly if they're not going to call an election. And we haven't had, Rishi Sunak had a prime opportunity to do that at Prime Minister's questions today, and he answered in a way which did not shut down the speculation.
Yes, indeed, and that was sort of resounding in its silence, wasn't it? Hannah, thank you very much indeed. And I should just explain to people watching, people who know about broadcasting from Downing Street will hear the music. There's not a party going on, there's a protest going on, so that's what you'll be hearing in the background. We can speak now to Chris Wilkins, who was Downing Street head of strategy when Theresa May was Prime Minister. Hello, good afternoon to you, Chris. Thanks so much for joining us. You will have been there at the heart of government, watching what was going on while Theresa May was making her decision to call a general election. What sort of things do Prime Ministers take into account?
Well, it's precisely a number of things. I was there during 2017 when we went through exactly this process. We got the cabinet together, announced it to the cabinet. Of course, the Prime Minister doesn't have to do that technically, but of course you get your team round, you tell them, and then you go out and announce it. It looks like that's what's happening now. And you take into account a variety of things. How will the opposition respond? What is it that they're going to say? Will they be on the back foot? Is one thing. You have to take into account what's going on in the country. It was just mentioned, for example, July 4th, if that is to be the date, does fall before the English school holidays, not the Scottish ones, but the English ones. You have to take into account things like that. How will the country be feeling? What will be going on? And then the other thing is what's going on in Parliament, because the moment you call an election, you have to then go into a process that's called wash-up, and that's kind of what legislation is going through Parliament that we really need to land and get on the books, and can we get that through before Parliament then rises for the campaign? And that is an important thing, because sometimes there's some things that you think, actually, this piece of legislation is really critical, we can't afford to drop it, so we need to get it through. So there's a whole host of things you have to think about before you make the call.
Chris, please do just stay on the line. I want to bring in another Chris, Chris Mason, our political editor, who has got another line to report.
Yeah, I can tell you, Rita, that at 5 o'clock, so in around 15 minutes, we are expecting, although whether the weather might interfere, let's see, the Prime Minister to address us in Downing Street with the expectation that he will be calling a summer general election. So the expectation is that we are moments away from a lectern moment when a Prime Minister comes out and addresses us. As I say, I wonder if the weather might tempt them to do it inside, but we shall see. Usually the expectation is that that lectern appears just behind us, and to make an obvious point, but it's worth making it on a day like this, Prime Ministers only do this kind of thing when they are making announcements of significant gravity, and that announcement is going to be that a general election is on its way.
Thank you very much indeed. So, Chris Wilkins, perhaps I can come back to you. You heard Chris Mason there saying that we can now report that there will be a lectern out here, probably in Downing Street, out in the street. Could it be something else? We don't absolutely know what it is. Could it be a different announcement?
I think it would be shocking at this stage if it were. I suppose there are maybe a handful of things that it could be. But I think the moment that you saw earlier today that Foreign Secretary was being called back from his trip and that Defence Secretary was being asked to delay his foreign travel, the moment you saw those two things, it began to crystallise that this was clearly what was going to happen. And then it really became, is the Prime Minister going to come out and call a general election for July the 4th? Well, there was some speculation about whether he would come out and call an election, but actually set the date for later in the year, which would be unusual, but there would be arguments in favour. But it does seem now like it's going to be July 4th. And the point about the lectern moment, and this is really critical, is because it's the moment that the Prime Minister gets to frame what he wants the general election to be about. And it's the kind of one moment right at the start where it's on your terms and you come out and you say, I'm going to call the general election, and this is what that election's about. And the framing battle about a general election campaign is all important. The person who wins the framing and sets what the question is about generally gets a good outcome at the end of the campaign period. So this, what we're going to see now, it sounds like, over the next half an hour or so, is really absolutely critical for Rishi Sunak.
And Chris, there had been some speculation that he might perhaps say something at Prime Minister's questions, but he batted that one away pretty rapidly. And that is because, as you say, he wants his moment here by himself, looking prime ministerial in Downing Street.
That's right. But he did say something interesting, actually, which I thought did slightly give the game away at Prime Minister's questions in answer to a different question. He used a line where he talked about the Conservatives providing security for the United Kingdom and a secure future for the United Kingdom. And it sounded to me like that was an election slogan that had been agreed. If you remember, he made a speech just last week, on Monday of last week, which was all about the future is insecure. There's lots happening in the world. It's quite a fragile place. And trying to make the argument that in that world, actually, the Conservative government is the best one to sort of steward the country through. And he draws on, what he did as Chancellor during COVID, etc. And that's kind of what he wanted. So when he used that line earlier, I thought, well, that's interesting, because that actually is the slogan that he wants to talk about. So yes, he wants this moment, clean now, in Downing Street, to say to the country, down the barrel of the camera, we're going to have a general election, and this is what I think it is about. And if you agree with it, that's what you think it's about, you need to vote for me. And it's a very rare opportunity to get that moment to talk directly to the country and to frame an issue in those terms.
And Chris, how much, assuming that he is going to come out and make the announcement that everybody is assuming that he is calling a general election, how much of his strategy will be in place? You've talked about policies, you've talked about the key points that he'll want to hit in order to frame the election, but how much more will have been worked out on top of that?
So, absolutely, they will have worked out at least a skeleton of what the next few weeks look like in terms of stories. So, generally what you do going into a campaign like this is the first few days is all about that framing piece. Every visit, every media opportunity, every statement is about saying, remember, we're having a general election, it's about this. For Boris Johnson, if you remember, that was, we're having a general election to get Brexit done. And by the end of the campaign, everyone thought that was what the election was about. Boris Johnson won. So they'll spend the first few days doing that. Then they'll have gridded out on this big grid a sense of the next few weeks what announcements they want to make, what are the sort of policy for the manifesto that they want to land, and how that brings the thing to life, how it brings the main theme to life. They will have some sense of that. Now, of course, events will happen. The other parties will have their view on that, but they will have a sense of the big policy ideas for the manifesto that they've been working on in recent months, so how they land those. And then the other thing is that they will have a very clear sense, to a very granular level, of the seats that they think are in play, the seats they think they've won already, where they don't have to campaign, the seats that are in play where they think they need to really target. And that will, of course, be the basis for where the Prime Minister goes, where the Cabinet go, where resources are put in it, where the media are targeted, all of that sort of stuff. All of that groundwork has been done by the campaign team. It's all sort of ready to go. And so it's then rolling out the ground campaign to try and get out the vote in the core seats that matter to them. Well, I think they're well prepped. I think Labour are well prepped as well. I'm sure the other parties are. But by making an announcement today, if indeed that's what he does do in the next few minutes, as we now expect, he's just stealing the march. And it's the prerogative of the Prime Minister to have this element of surprise, just to get one ahead of the other parties and be able to start that process quickly. And so that's kind of the opportunity he has now in the next hour or so.
So good to talk to you, really fascinating. Thank you so much. That's Chris Wilkins there, former head of strategy for the former Prime Minister Theresa May. For anybody just tuning in and joining us now, you're watching a BBC special. We are waiting for the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to make an announcement. We're told that a lectern is going to be set up. We are assuming here in Downing Street, although as you can see, it is very wet, very soggy. It's possible that this happens inside Downing Street as well, but we are expecting a statement from the Prime Minister at 5 o'clock, and speculation is rife that he will be calling a general election. Well, while we wait, I'm happy to say we can speak to the chief leader writer for the Observer newspaper and former Labour advisor, Sonia Sotha. Hi there, Sonia. Thank you so much for joining us. So, well, Labour has been saying for many weeks now, bring it on. So will they be pleased?
Apologies about that. Hopefully you can hear me now.
I can't hear you. Are you muted?
Can you hear
yes,
me now?
marvellous. Yes, go ahead.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Sorry about that. So I was just going to say that I think in Labour HQ, the feeling will be one of absolute delight, as you just hinted at there. they've been preparing to be on an election footing for some weeks and months now. And in fact, it's believed that some of the rumours about an early general election actually originated from Labour itself, where you've got election chiefs, basically warning shadow cabinet members, it could come at any point. You need to be ready. So, I think Labour wanted the election to be sooner rather than later. So if it does turn out it's on Thursday, the 4th of July, there will be a feeling of delight.
And Sir Keir Starmer, of course, made that, what felt very much like the beginning of an election campaign appearance just a few days ago.
Yes, that's right. I think last week it actually felt like we didn't know when the general election was going to be. And, last week I was thinking it was most likely to be in, towards the end of the year. But we really had a moment where it felt like both party leaders were launching their long general election campaign. You had Rishi Sunak give a speech and say, well, this is a security election. And then you had Keir Starmer come out and launch that pledge card. Very strong focus on the economy, on the NHS and public services, which is actually where we know the public are going to be. So I think we can expect in this general election campaign for both parties, to sort of not just be fighting over the issues, but be determined to keep the election campaign on the issues that they think they perform most strongly on. That's why you had Sunak, the Prime Minister, sort of trying to make it a general election about international affairs and international security. The problem for him is that when you ask the public about what they care about, it's consistently things like the economy and the NHS are coming on top. And those are issues where Labour are way out ahead on.
I should just say to people who are watching, we are expecting an announcement by the Prime Minister, but I am being advised that there might be some delay, partly because of the weather. As you can see, lovely May British weather here. You can hear the rain coming down. And there isn't a lectern out there, a podium out there at the moment. So do stay tuned, because we will bring you the news as soon as it comes. There is still very heightened speculation that we'll be hearing from the Prime Minister very soon. In fact, it's been confirmed that we will, but that 5 o'clock time might have slipped. Sonia, you were talking, in fact, I'm being told, it's very febrile here. I was being told that a lectern was coming out, but it's a PA system. Sorry about that. These things will happen. Sonia, you were talking about Labour wanting to fight on public services, but this will now be a moment of truth for Labour, won't it? They're very significantly ahead in the polls, but they have been criticised repeatedly for not being detailed enough in terms of their policies, in terms of their figures, and in terms of costing. That's all going to have to change now.
Well, there's certainly going to be more scrutiny on Labour and their set of policies as we move forward to an election. I mean, that's exactly what you'd expect. Labour, though, have played a very cautious strategy, I think, which is, they're saying that they've tied themselves to the same macroeconomic rules that the Conservative have on spending and on debt. And that means that they've got limited headroom to do the things that they'd like to do. You've had very, very careful messaging from Labour's shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves. The Labour leadership is very clear that anything they say they're going to do that costs money, they will have fully costed, and they will say where that money is coming from. So, for example, the extra bits of spending that you've got on the NHS, the extra spending on teachers for schools, they say that's all accounted for in terms of specific small bits of tax rises, for example, that would hit companies, for example, particular companies. So that's there is policy, and I expect that we can hear more of it. But it's certainly true that there's been a lot of Labour strategists behind the scenes have been concerned that there could be some softening of the Labour lead during a general election campaign as kind of people start to make their mind up. But I think the thing is, when you're 20 points ahead in the polls, obviously your strategists are going to be concerned about that. But that is a very, very healthy lead to be going into a general election campaign on.
And yet, just picking up on something that you said there, things will improve under Labour, but there's only limited scope for improvement. I mean, that's not a great message, is it?
Well, I think the message that Labour are trying to sort of put forwards for the electorate is that these are really difficult circumstances. These are difficult circumstances. If they win an election, there'll be difficult circumstances to be inheriting, and that's because when you look at the economy, they're very much, there are long-standing issues with productivity, with growth, with stagnating wages. We've had very high rates of inflation, high price rises baked into the economy. Even though that's come down, we've seen prices increased by 20% since 2021. So if people are feeling, they are not feeling well off when they're looking at their own family budgets. And Labour have got kind of the same situation when they're looking at national spending and tax revenues and what they're going to have to do. So, I think some of what Labour is saying is quite cautious in the sense that they're saying that they're a change Labour Party. We're not going to go into a general election in 2019 promising the kinds of things that Jeremy Corbyn did at the last general election. I think the hope on the Labour side will be that that's kind of a realistic pitch and that the country wants change, but they also don't want politicians, they're not in the mood for politicians to be promising them something that they see as magical thinking that they don't believe can be delivered.
Always good to talk to you. Thank you so much. That's Sonia Sodha there, writer for The Observer newspaper and former Labour advisor. Thank you so much. Can I bring in Chris Mason once again? Chris, I think you were saying there might be some delay because of the weather. Maybe there is, but the rain is easing off, so perhaps.
The rain is easing off, and if the sun hasn't quite come out, it feels a little brighter than it did a few minutes ago, albeit it seemed to be getting worse, didn't it, a few minutes ago. Sounds trivial, that, but it'll matter, and it'll matter in there because
he wants it to look.
Yeah, because this is a moment where you're talking to the archive as a Prime Minister. In other words, it's something that gets played over and over again. It's a chapter in your own story, if you like, as a Prime Minister, as part of the country's story. Just to explain what's been going on in the street as you were in the middle of that conversation there, we're seeing elements of the choreography of this moment taking shape. Just below my left foot, just beyond the camera shot, is a giant speaker, so we'll be able to hear the Prime Minister's words. In fact, a wire is about to be attached to the back of it, which will make that possible. I think fairly soon we will see that lectern appear, and then shortly after that, hear from the Prime Minister. Things often slip, so the expectation was we'd be hearing from him at 5 o'clock. It is now, 3 minutes past? I suspect we'll probably, and I'm guessing now, 10 minutes or so away at least, given the time it takes to set things up and test the equipment. But all of that is detail. Where we are this evening is on the brink of a general election campaign, where the power will depart this street. This street is all about power. It's about where power resides, and it resides behind that black door in the hands of the Prime Minister. And what we will hear from the Prime Minister is the moment where that power heads out, and it heads out into the hands of the electorate, millions of people making individual decisions that shape how we are governed. And of course, between this point and the point that polling stations open, there will be a wall of noise, a huge amount of persuasion. We will hear, won't we, about promises and manifestos and track records and parties setting out their own case and trying to destroy their opponents' cases. We'll see general election debates. We'll see missteps from the various parties. We'll see records challenged, argued passionately for, trashed by rivals. And then ultimately that sense that, yes, power will be handed to the electorate. And for all of the noise and cynicism and scepticism that can so often wash around politics, we should never forget the significance of this moment. That fact that power will be in the hands of the electorate to make a profound decision about how we're governed for up to the next 5 years. And we're just moments away from that official starting gun being fired.
So Chris, you've stood here in Downing Street so many times over the last few years for announcements like this, and it strikes me that this is 14 years to the month since the Conservatives came into power, since David Cameron became the largest party and then spent time negotiating with Nick Clegg.
Indeed so, yeah. And you think of what has happened over those 14 years, a period of coalition government for the first time in a very long time, where there was a strand of conversation from the likes of you and me that perfectly reasonably in the early days questioned how stable it would be. Turned out it was a very stable government that lasted its whole term, perhaps more stable than the government that went before it and the government that came after it. Of course, we had all of the noise of the Brexit arguments that tore the Conservative Party into plenty of pieces, divided the country, and redefined how people even articulated their own political outlook. For so long, people defining themselves so often as Leavers or Remainers rather than via any other badge of political affiliation. And then that moment of nearly 5 years ago, with Boris Johnson securing that very significant majority, where all of the talk then was an expectation that he had the opportunity potentially to govern for up to 10 years. The thought that it would be too big a challenge for a Labour Party that had suffered its worst general election result since 1935 to possibly haul itself back into competitiveness, let alone the prospect of a potential victory in just one parliamentary term. And yet here we are on the brink of a general election campaign where Labour feel confident, they are determined not to be complacent, but you look at the polling evidence and recent electoral records, and Labour believe they have grounds to be confident, and plenty of Conservatives, as we embark on the weeks to come, do anticipate defeat. But we can put that to one side. That's the backdrop, that's the conversation that will go on amongst folk like me in the next 5 or 6 weeks. But again, the power lies with the people. People will decide, and campaigns can make a difference. Just ask Theresa May. She thought, back in 2017, that she took a look at the opinion polls, thought a sizable majority would be useful in trying to deliver Brexit, called a general election, and the electorate thought otherwise. The campaign went in a different way from how many had anticipated it. The opinion polls shrivelled from a very wide margin to next to nothing, and the result was a huge surprise. Again, an indication. You can just never tell.
Stay there a moment, Chris. I know that some people will be wondering what the sound behind me is. It's just stopped, but I just want to show you there are protests that are going on just outside the Downing Street gates, and there they are starting up again. And this is just something that is part of the backdrop to broadcasting from Downing Street. Chris, if I can just bring you back in, Rishi Sunak will have had many things to consider. But while we can't see into his mind, of course, his legacy will be one of them. Yeah. And that will presumably be partly why he's going today, if indeed he is.
His legacy, as far as his place in history, as in the widest sense, as a Prime Minister, but then also a legacy within the Conservative Party. And that's been part of the tussle that's been going on privately amongst those closest to Rishi Sunak about when to go for an election. Clearly and perfectly rationally, from the perspective of a Prime Minister, he wants to do that at the point where they collectively judge he gives himself the best chance of doing as well as he possibly can. And there have been senior Conservatives saying to him that the fear from their perspective was waiting any longer could make what they fear might be for them a bad situation worse, and therefore it could be in the interests of the party to go sooner. Now, the more negative interpretation of that from plenty privately is about, from their perspective, minimising the scale of defeat. But again, as I say, I don't seek to be presumptive, because again, that will be up to the electorate and up to the campaigners to make their arguments in the next 5 or 6 weeks. But that's at the heart of the conversation that's been going on, and yeah, he will have had an eye to that. And concluding, it would seem that of all of the dates that he could have picked to come out and talk to the country from the lectern, that of all of the dates between now and pretty much December the 17th, I think it is, that this, from his perspective, is the best time. The 17th is
the last day that he
I think that's the last time where Parliament would effectively automatically dissolve, and it would happen a period of weeks later at the end of January. Up until that point, he has the power to make the decision. Beyond that point, it would happen anyway.
Chris, no sooner did I say it stopped raining than it started raining, and your glasses are rather wet. So I'll just let you get under an umbrella for a little while. Don't go too far away. We'll be back to you very shortly. Chris Mason there, of course, our political editor. I'd like to go back to the newsroom and speak to Hannah White again from the Institute for Government. And Hannah, you've watched these things over many years. Talk to us a little bit about the choreography of calling an election?
Well, the key thing, as Chris was saying there, is for the Prime Minister to keep his deliberations very private between him and a very small trusted group, and really not to allow that information to leak before time. And I think Rishi Sunak's done a very successful job. If he is calling an election today, it's really only late last night, early this morning that speculation started to really gather pace.
Hannah, I just want to cut into you because there is a great deal of commotion here, not because of the Prime Minister, but because of the lectern. So confirmation, if it were needed, that he will in fact be here very shortly. So lots of calls from photographers who want it right in front of them, of course, and we've got PA systems roundabout behind us. So a great sense of sort of expectation here in Downing Street, as you might expect. Okay, sorry to focus on an inanimate object there, but it is partly a sign that this is going to happen. Hannah, please do pick up again. You were talking about the choreography.
Lectern's very important. No, so what then happens once the decision's been made? The Prime Minister has to ask the King, it's the royal prerogative, to actually dissolve Parliament, and having been given that permission by the King, then the election date can be set. Also the date of when a Parliament would meet again after an election can be set. And then it's really just a question of Parliament concluding its business, the government and the opposition parties getting together, looking at what legislation is going through, and agreeing the wash-up period, what legislation is going to get onto the statute book. Some bills might get gutted, controversial bits cut out, other bits going through. The Prime Minister, I think, will be very hopeful that his tobacco and vapes bill gets through, and that's relatively has some cross-party agreement, so that's quite likely. There's a finance bill that needs to go through. There are some other more controversial bills that might not make it. Then Parliament gets dissolved, and really that's the point at which the short campaign starts properly. We would expect for a July 4th election that to happen next Thursday. And then you get into the election campaign at some point, normally sort of 18 to 20 days out from the election. You see the manifestos published by the parties. It's a bit variable. Often the opposition will try to go first with their manifesto to steal a bit of the limelight from the government, but again that's very much up to them. And then we would be going up to the 4th of July. Of course, the other thing that will be going on is in government, the civil service working very quickly to try to work out what needs to be done before Parliament is resolved, whether there are any public appointments or big decisions that they need to be made, which couldn't be made during used to be called the purdah period, when the civil service can't be making big decisions of that kind. So there's a big sort of clearing up exercise.
And Hannah, would it be right to say that we've been in a particularly general election rich era in the last few years? There was one in 2015, 17, 19 and now. How unusual is that?
I think that is pretty unusual. When you think back to 2010, and we had the Fixed Term Parliaments Act introduced as part of the coalition agreement at the start of that Parliament, and we thought at that time that we were set for a period of elections every 5 years, that would become a sort of steady drumbeat, that it was no longer up to the Prime Minister to determine when elections should happen. But of course that reckoned without Brexit, reckoned without the
Here
need
he is,
that
Hannah. Here he is.
Here.
In the last 5 years, our country has fought through the most challenging times since the Second World War. As I stand here as your Prime Minister, I can't help but reflect that my first proper introduction to you was just over 4 years ago. I stood behind one of the podiums, upstairs in the building behind me. I told you that we faced a generation-defining moment, and that we as a society would not be judged by some government action, but by the small acts of kindness that we showed one another. You met that challenge, and then some, and I have never been prouder to be British. And when I introduced the furlough scheme, I did so not because I saw a country simply in need of desperate help, albeit we were, but because I saw a country whose future hung in the balance. I could be bold and trust in the tens of millions of you at home that you would rise to the moment, or I could accept the inevitable millions of job losses and pick up the pieces. In truth, it was no choice at all. I have never and will never leave the people of this country to face the darkest of days alone. And you know that because you've seen it. As I did then, I will forever do everything in my power to provide you with the strongest possible protection I can. That is my promise to you. Because for so many of us, it's easy to forget the scale of what we've been through. We were hit by a pandemic that upended normal life. Who would have thought that the government would ever tell us how many times a day we could leave our homes? Then, just as we were recovering from COVID, war returned to Europe, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine sending your energy bills spiralling. I came to office, above all, to restore economic stability. Economic stability is the bedrock of any future success, whether that is rising wages and good jobs, investment in our public services, or the defence of the country. And because of our collective sacrifice and your hard work, we have reached two major milestones in delivering that stability, showing that when we work together, anything is possible. Our economy is now growing faster than anyone predicted, outpacing Germany, France, and the United States. And this morning it was confirmed that inflation is back to normal. This means that the pressure on prices will ease and mortgage rates will come down. This is proof that the plan and priorities I set out are working. I recognise that it has not always been easy. Some of you will only just be starting to feel the benefits, and for some, it might still be hard when you look at your bank balance. But this hard-earned economic stability was only ever meant to be the beginning. The question now is how, and who do you trust to turn that foundation into a secure future for you, your family, and our country. Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future, to decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July. This election will take place at a time when the world is more dangerous than it has been since the end of the Cold War. Putin's Russia is waging a brutal war in Ukraine and will not stop there if he succeeds. That war has also made it all too clear the risk to our energy security. In the Middle East, the forces of Islamist extremism threaten regional and ultimately global stability. These tensions are exploited by extremists who seek to undermine our values and divide our society here at home. China is looking to dominate the 21st century by stealing a lead in technology. And migration is being weaponized by hostile states to threaten the integrity of our borders. These uncertain times call for a clear plan and bold action to chart a course to a secure future. You must choose in this election who has that plan, who is prepared to take the bold action necessary to secure a better future for our country and our children. Now, I cannot and will not claim that we have got everything right. No government should. But I am proud of what we have achieved together, the bold actions we have taken, and I'm confident about what we can do in the future. We've tackled inflation, controlled debt, cut workers' taxes, and increased the state pension by £900. We've reduced taxes on investment and seized the opportunities of Brexit to make this the best country in the world to grow a business. Put record amounts of funding into our NHS and ensured it is now training the doctors and nurses it needs in the decades to come. We've reformed education, and our children are now the best readers in the Western world. We prioritised energy security and your family finances over environmental dogma in our approach to net zero. We fully funded an increase in defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. We made a decision to invest more in local transport that you actually use, rather than endlessly plough more money into HS2. We set out a comprehensive plan to reform our welfare system, to make it fair for those who pay for it as well as those who need it. Immigration is finally coming down, and we are stopping the boats with our Rwanda partnership. And we will ensure that the next generation grows up smoke-free. I hope that my work since I became Prime Minister shows that we have a plan and are prepared to take bold action necessary for our country to flourish. Now, I've stuck with that plan and always been honest with you about what is needed, even when that's been difficult. Because I'm guided by doing what is right for our country, not what is easy. Now, I can't say the same thing for the Labour Party, because I don't know what they offer. And in truth, I don't think you know either. And that's because they have no plan. There is no bold action. And as a result, the future can only be uncertain with them. On the 5th of July, either Keir Starmer or I will be Prime Minister. He has shown time and time again that he will take the easy way out and do anything to get power. If he was happy to abandon all the promises he made to become Labour leader once he got the job, how can you know that he won't do exactly the same thing if he were to become Prime Minister? If you don't have the conviction to stick to anything you say, if you don't have the courage to tell people what you want to do, and if you don't have a plan, how can you possibly be trusted to lead our country, especially at this most uncertain of times? Over the next few weeks, I will fight for every vote. I will earn your trust, and I will prove to you that only a Conservative government led by me will not put our hard-earned economic stability at risk, can restore pride and confidence in our country, and with a clear plan and bold action, will deliver a secure future for you, your family, and our United Kingdom.
There we have it. There we have it, the statement from the Prime Minister that everybody has been waiting for, made, as you saw, in the pouring rain. Possibly it became the worst kept secret in Westminster, the Prime Minister there confirming a general election for Thursday, July the 4th. I'm joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, who was listening to everything. So, Vicky, some very clear themes emerging there from what he said.
Yeah, and I think security being the really big one there. You might remember that last week, Rishi Sunak made a speech about security, and last week really started to feel a bit like a general election campaign as he laid out those themes. But that is what he and the Conservative Party are going to focus on. They're going to talk about security, about the risk to the country, and he will argue that he has helped people through difficult times. You'll hear a lot about that because the Conservative record is patchy. They know that. There's a reason why they are so far behind in the opinion polls. What they will, the argument they will make is that we've been through a difficult time. We've had a pandemic. We've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of these have put huge pressures on the country, and he will say that as Chancellor first with the furlough scheme, and since then he has helped people at a very difficult time, and he will try to contrast that with Labour, and he will say they have no plan. Now there's a challenge here for Labour, definitely. Sir Keir Starmer is still, he's the leader of the opposition, of course. That's not the same as when you've been through a general election campaign and people start to know you better. He will have to introduce himself again to the British people, Sir Keir Starmer, and lay out what a Labour government would do. And what the Tories will try and do is say that they don't have a plan, that they don't have policies, that people have no idea what they will do. And I think you can see that framing very quickly there from the outset.
So a few things struck me, Vicky. He spoke initially about challenging times, about generation-defining times, and kindness, and he linked that to his own role as Chancellor with the furlough scheme, reminding people for whom the COVID days may be far distant of the role that he played.
Yeah, that's right. That was a huge step for him. He was, a very junior minister, really, and he's had a meteoric rise, to Chancellor, and then, of course, now to Prime Minister, and wants to remind people how the Conservative government helped them. Now, of course, that's without mentioning the other things that went on during COVID and all sorts of questions that were asked, of course, during Boris Johnson's time about Partygate that went on here. The Cabinet now leaving here, just as you can see, I don't know if you can see those pictures there, through the pouring rain, Mel Stride there in the middle, the Work and Pensions Secretary. And we're saying, Reeta, that there is shock amongst Tory MPs, actually, about all of this. I was over in the House of Commons as these rumours were circulating, and when you said, look, it looks like a general election's on, they couldn't really believe it, because for so many of them, they know that that's it for them. Lots of them have said they're standing down. Lots of them know they will lose their seats. I think they all thought it was going to be the autumn, because they're wondering, well, what's changed since he didn't have an election in May at the same time as the locals, and then he's now saying July the 4th. What has changed in that time? They all felt that by not going in May, it was going to be in the autumn. So I think they're quite surprised that it's happened. And also, a Prime Minister calling an election when they are so far behind in opinion polls, when they don't have to, is very, very unusual. I mean, John Major's the nearest equivalent that we have really in recent times, back in 1997, but he was running out of time. He held it right at the end of that parliament. You know, Rishi Sunak doesn't have to do this election until January next year, but he's decided to go now. And I think there'll be a lot of people speculating about why he's decided to do that, presumably because he doesn't think that things are going to improve in the short term enough to change the dial. I think there's lots of Tory MPs frustrated, actually. He's announced various measures. None of it seems to have shifted those opinion polls. So obviously he's now decided that it's the time to go. But it does leave a lot of Tory MPs, of course, looking at the end of their careers.
Vicky, don't go very far away. I just want to bring in Professor Sir John Curtis from the University of Strathclyde, who of course looks at the election prospects and figures for us every year. Good to have you on the programme, Sir John. So just speaking to Vicky's point there, a lot of shock amongst Tory MPs given where the Conservatives are in the polls. Just spell out for us the challenge for the main parties now that we are about to enter a general election campaign.
Well, the truth is the Conservative Party do face a major challenge. As you've said, it's a challenge not dissimilar to that John Major faced in 1997, but Mr Major did almost go all the way to the legal limit of that parliament. On average, in the polls that have been conducted so far this month, the Labour Party on 44% are 21 points ahead of the Conservatives on 23 points. That is an enormous figure to turn around, particularly if you bear in mind that even if the polls narrow and maybe we get into the area of a hung parliament, which perhaps is at the top end of reasonable expectations for the Conservatives at the moment, because neither the Liberal Democrats nor the Scottish National Party are willing to vote for a minority Conservative King's Speech, the Conservatives have to get themselves almost way back to 326 if Rishi Sunak is going to remain the tenant of 10 Downing Street. So it is a very, very substantial challenge. For the other parties, well, the Liberal Democrats are running on average in the polls at around 10-11%, no better than they were back in 2019, but they are hoping to profit from Conservative misfortune in those constituencies where they start off in second place. One of the challenges that the Conservative Party now faces, in which in a sense things have got more difficult for them in the last 6 months, is that actually the party that is now picking up most votes from the Conservatives is not Labour but Reform. They're running at 11 or 12% in the polls. And here we should remember Reform, i.e. the Brexit Party, did not stand in Conservative-held constituencies back in 2019. If Richard Tice sticks to his determination to do so this time, then even if Reform votes get squeezed during the campaign, they're getting 5 or 6%. That's going to be 5 or 6% often off the Conservative total in the very seats they're trying to defend. The Greens will be hopeful. They've had their best parliament so far as the opinion polls are concerned. They're running at 7%, and they've got 1 or 2 constituencies they've got their eye on, although of course Caroline Lucas is standing down in Brighton. North of the border, I think the Scottish National Party will not welcome this early election. They have just replaced their leader. John Swinney is hoping to turn things around. And at the moment, the Scottish National Party is running about 5 or 6 points behind Labour in the polls north of the border. So the truth is, this just looks like an election for Labour to win. And I guess there are almost 2 words that come to mind so far as the Prime Minister's decision is concerned, is he's either very brave or extremely foolhardy. And we will discover in the early hours of the 5th of July which of those judgments prove to be correct.
And Sir John, you speak about Labour being so far ahead in the polls, and yet they go on talking about not being complacent. And there are electoral changes as well, aren't there? There are boundary changes.
Yes.
Does that make it more difficult for Labour?
The boundary changes do make it somewhat more difficult for Labour. So whereas On the standard arithmetic we all use, and I'll come back to that in a moment, the Labour Party needed around a 12-point lead over the Conservatives to get a majority of one on the old boundaries. That now figure looks now more like 13 to 14%. So the boundary review has made things a little bit more difficult for Labour, but not dramatically so. However, one of the challenges that faces the Conservatives is that both those so-called MRP polls, those big polls where you interview a lot of people and then statisticians attempt to model the change in party support to estimate what's going to happen in the constituencies, or if you look at the local elections just 2 or 3 weeks ago, a clear pattern in both is that the Conservative vote is falling more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. And that, under our electoral system, is potentially very bad news indeed. In other words, it means that for any given share of the vote, the Conservatives are at risk of losing more seats than we'd otherwise expect. And an electoral system that was very kind to them back in 2019 and enabled Boris Johnson to get his overall majority of 80. If the local elections are any guide and the opinion polls are any guide, there is now a risk that the electoral system will be nothing like as kind to the Conservatives this time. Much the same, by the way, was the case back in 1997 when the Conservatives faced a not dissimilar situation and with their vote falling away quite heavily.
OK, always good to talk to you, Sir John. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go very shortly to a former Downing Street advisor, but I just want to bring Vicky Young back in, our deputy political editor, because, of course, lots of people contacting you, Vicky, given the announcement. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so this is about the choreography, actually, of what happens next. So from Downing Street, this has come out. The Prime Minister, as we heard, has asked the King to proclaim the dissolution of Parliament. His Majesty has done that and will comply with that request. So that means Parliament will be prorogued on Friday the 24th, that's this Friday. Dissolution will take place on Thursday the 30th of May. So it was supposed to be recess. It's half term for many schools next week. That's gone in terms of Parliament. They will do as many bits of legislation as they can get through in that short time. The general election, as we know, on Thursday the 4th of July. The new Parliament will be summoned to meet on Tuesday the 9th of July. First thing they do then is elect a speaker, they swear in members, and the state opening will be on Wednesday the 17th of July. And then just one other thing, in terms of response from Labour, there hasn't been anything official yet, apart from Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, seen walking through the building across the road saying, "Bring it on." And that tweet gone out saying the same thing from Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor.
Vicky, thank you very much. Back with you shortly, and lots of dates for our diaries there. Thank you very much. Well, as I said, I want to go now to back to John Curtis. I beg your pardon. We're going to speak now to Mo Hussein, who is a former Downing Street advisor and a press office advisor. Mo, good to have you on the programme. You're watching Rishi Sunak there. What did you think about the presentation and what he had to say?
Well, there's been a lot of rumbling about this today, and Number 10 weren't doing very much from the communication side to try and lock it down, which in itself is quite telling. And I think there's been a big debate around, do you go long or do you go earlier, as we've seen now? And looking at the economic data the government's had recently, whether it's inflation stats or a bit more growth that we saw last week, considering migration starts coming out tomorrow, potentially the first flight to Rwanda, it feels like there's a choreography of slightly better news for the government that they can probably capitalise on more rather than perhaps wait and potentially squander. I think that has been the debate behind the scenes, and clearly the people who want to move quickly seem to have won the argument.
And in terms of what he had to say, what was what did you take away from that? The framing of the way in which he wants this campaign to run?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because the Prime Minister doesn't have many cards that he can play. You know, he made these 5 big commitments, but the one that is closest to being met on inflation, we saw the outcome of that today. So I think him saying, look, we're not saying everything is perfect, the job hasn't been fully completed, but I've shown you that I can make these changes. Playing the safety first card, stick with me, rather than throwing it all to the wind and risking another change. I think that's probably the strongest card he has. And that's what we will hear a lot more from as well. It was also interesting that he spoke about his previous role as Chancellor. That's when he really connected with the country in a very, very different way, not least with the furlough scheme, when he was paying people's wages for quite a long period of time. And he was much more popular personally than he is now. So I think looking back to that time and reminding people of his role then was telling. And again, that will be a recurring theme. With that does come a risk, because then you are also opening yourself up for answering questions about the longer term Conservative record, not just your role as Chancellor. And then I think him talking about security in general, we've heard him talk about security before. I'm not sure that why the message around geopolitics and defence necessarily cuts through on the doorstep. I'm not sure people are going to vote on that. But adding to the mix that, look, the world is unstable. Do you really want to make another change and potentially ruin the small progress we have made? Again, that will be a consistent theme as well from not many choices that he has.
Very good to talk to you. Thank you very much. That's Mo Hussein there, the former Downing Street advisor. I'd like to go now to our correspondent in Glasgow, Lorna Gordon. Lorna, just looking at the election and what Rishi Sunak had to say, what sort of battle lines will there be in Scotland, and has there yet been any political reaction there?
I remember the last time there was a general election here in Scotland, the SNP won the most seats by a considerable margin. But I think it's fair to say it'll be a much more competitive general election this time around. Remember that Labour won this part of West Central Scotland, Hamilton, Rutherglen and Hamilton West in a by-election last year. They'll be hoping to win this seat again and other seats like it in West Central Scotland, east of Edinburgh, and perhaps as far afield as the Western Isles. Certainly the polling suggests that, the last 5 polls put Labour on 36% here in Scotland and the SNP on 32%. That's only 4-5% difference, but it's how it affects the seats. And there are a lot of marginal seats here in Scotland. Labour will be hoping to wrestle them back from the SNP. The Conservatives, their response has been they're feeling quite confident. They'll be looking perhaps to gain seats in the north-east of Scotland as well. And it's a challenge for Scotland's new First Minister, John Swinney. He's just in post. He's had a new cabinet. Today he was setting out his priorities for government, and that has been swept aside with this news of a general election in July. He's going to have to get his head, he's going to have to get his party, and he's going to have to get his campaign in gear to hold on to those seats in Scotland. And there's a lot to play for here.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Lorna. Let's cross now to Cardiff and speak to our correspondent there, Thomas Morgan. Thomas, this news of the election date, July the 4th, just made in the last few minutes. Has there been any reaction there?
Not so far. I think really, though, back in 19, when we looked at the fight here in Wales, I think the fight was focused almost entirely up in North East Wales, the so-called red wall seats there, and most of the voters there did actually switch from red to blue, and if the polls remain as they are, I'm sure it looks like they could switch back, really, and that is where many of the campaign, I'm sure, will be focused over the next couple of weeks. However, the makeup of those constituencies will be different, because in July 40 MPs in Wales do become 32. And what does that mean? Well, it means that in certain seats as well, Labour may be targeting some of the big hitters. For example, 3 former Welsh Secretary seats and the current Welsh Secretary seat may be up for grabs for Labour. The only seat that isn't changing is on the Isle of Anglesey, which today it was announced will be the next preferred site for a nuclear power plant across the UK. Now, of course, this is going to be a big election for everybody, and in Wales the focus will be on those key battlegrounds, as I say, but here in South Wales There has been some disquiet amongst the public, especially because of the 20 miles per hour speed limit that is now going to be changed after such a backlash here in Wales. So how will that affect voting come July the 4th? And there also has been pressure on the still relatively new First Minister Vaughan Gething after the donation he received for his leadership campaign, £200,000 given to him by a man that was twice convicted of environmental offences. So no doubt the Tories will use those two things to attack Labour here in Wales. They'll also go after Labour's track record on education and health here in Wales, and the reverse from Labour will no doubt be, well, we're not receiving enough money from Westminster to fund those public services.
Thomas Morgan there in Cardiff, thank you very much. Well, let's cross now to Belfast and speak to our island correspondent Sarah Girvan. And Thomas and Lorna both making the points that the First Ministers in their respective assemblies are relatively new. Well, that could also be said for Michelle O'Neill. What are the issues going to be in Northern Ireland, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Northern Ireland's power-sharing government is just up and running again for really only a matter of months after a 2-year hiatus. And as you say, Michelle O'Neill from Sinn Féin, the First Minister for the first time, and Emma Little-Pengelly, the Deputy First Minister from the DUP. We have just started to have a little bit of reaction from the political parties start to trickle through. We've heard from the DUP. They say the government was running out of steam, as they put it, and we've heard from the SDLP, and they've called this election Operation Remove the Tories. So they're making their stance very, very clear. And there are 18 seats, Westminster seats in Northern Ireland, just to remind you of that. And they are mainly split between the two biggest political parties here in Northern Ireland. So the DUP has 8 and Sinn Féin has 7. And as I say, it has just been up and running again, a matter of weeks. And when Stormont did come back, it did so with Sinn Féin as the biggest party, and they will certainly be hoping to recreate that success at Westminster, even though they have an abstentionist policy, which means that their MPs don't actually take their seats. And calling this election, well, it could definitely be argued that it's bad timing for the DUP. Back in March, their former leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, stood down after being accused of rape, and he's now facing 10 other sexual offences charges, historical charges. He's denying all of those, but his solicitor did say today he will not be standing for re-election. Then there's a new leader of the DUP, Gavin Robinson. He's now facing just weeks into a new job, leading his party through a general election and also defending his seat in East Belfast. So as always in Northern Ireland, Reeta, lots and lots in the mix and lots to consider until the July the 4th.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. Our Ireland correspondent there, Sarah Girvan. I've got Vicky Young still here with me, Deputy Political Editor. We're waiting for the Labour leader to say something, Vicky. Do you have anything?
Yeah, of course. We're waiting for that reaction. He has posted a video, and in it he says that give the Tories 5 more years and things will only get worse. Britain deserves better than that. With the theme change, I have to say it's somewhere a lot sunnier than it is here. But of course, this is going to be, a huge period of time for him. He has not led the party through a general election before. There will be scrutiny for his party and for himself like never before. And there will be a lot of pressure on Labour to say what they will do. They want this election to be fought on the Tories' record. The Tories want it to be really fought on what might happen next. And they want to put lots of pressure on Labour about what their plans are, whether they have detailed plans. But, things are, a lot of things need answering, a lot of things need fixing, and both sides will come under a lot of scrutiny about what they're going to do about it. And I think for Sir Keir Starmer being that far ahead in the polls puts a certain pressure as well, a different kind of pressure. But Labour are...
It's theirs to lose, to a certain extent.
It is theirs to lose, apart from the fact that if you look at the last general election result, Labour did so badly, they have a lot of room to catch up. They have to win over 120 seats they don't currently hold. And that's a lot.
That's
that is
a big
lot
hill.
of places they have to win in. They will look at the recent local election results and they will feel buoyed by the fact that they were winning in lots of parts of England, not just in the north, not just in the cities. They were winning in lots of other places too. But they also know that they can't be complacent, and that's been a message from them for months and months and months, that they are not complacent, because they do understand how big a challenge it is going to be for them over the next few weeks.
Vicky, thank you very much as always. Vicky Young, our Deputy Political Editor there. So if you happen to be just joining us, the news is that the Prime Minister has announced the date of a general election. But I'm going to take you now to Sir Keir Starmer, Labour leader.
Thank you. Tonight, the Prime Minister has finally announced the next general election, a moment the country needs and has been waiting for, and where, by the force of our democracy, power returns to you. A chance to change for the better your future, your community, your country. Now, it will feel like a long campaign, I'm sure of that. But no matter what else is said and done, that opportunity for change is what this election is about. Over the course of the last 4 years, we've changed the Labour Party, returned it once more to the service of working people. All we ask now, humbly, is to do exactly the same for our country and return Britain to the service of working people. To that purpose, we offer why you should change Britain with Labour. One, because we will stop the chaos. Look around our country. The sewage in our rivers, people waiting on trolleys in A&E, crime virtually unpunished, mortgages and food prices through the roof. It's all, every bit of it, a direct result of the Tory chaos in Westminster. Time and again, they pursue their own interests rather than tackling the issues that affect your family. And if they get another 5 years, they will feel entitled to carry on exactly as they are. Nothing will change. A vote for Labour is a vote for stability, economic and political. A politics that treads more lightly on all our lives. A vote to stop the chaos. Two, because it's time for change. Our offer is to reset both our economy and our politics so that they once again serve the interests of working people. We totally reject the Tory view that economic strength is somehow gifted from those at the top. Over the past 14 years, through all the crises we've had to face, sticking with that idea has left our country exposed, insecure, and unable to unlock the potential of every community. But a vote for Labour is a vote to turn the page on all that. A vote for change. And finally, three, because we have a long-term plan to rebuild Britain. A plan that is ready to go, fully costed and fully funded. We can deliver economic stability, cut the NHS waiting times, secure our borders with a new border security command, harness great British energy to cut your bills for good, tackle antisocial behaviour, and get the teachers we need in your children's classroom. But most importantly of all, we do all this with a new spirit of service, country first, party second. A rejection of the gesture politics you will see in this campaign, I have no doubt, from the Tories and the SNP. I'm well aware of the cynicism people hold towards politicians at the moment. But I came into politics late, having served our country as leader of the Crown Prosecution Service. And I helped the police service in Northern Ireland to gain the consent of all communities. service of our country is the reason and the only reason why I am standing here now asking for your vote. And I believe with patience, determination, and that commitment to service, there is so much pride and potential we can unlock across our country. So here it is, the future of the country in your hands. On the 4th of July, you have the choice. And together, we can stop the chaos, we can turn the page, we can start to rebuild Britain and change our country. Thank you.
Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader there, responding to the call of a general election here in a very wet Downing Street. Welcome to Westminster. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. Let me just bring in Vicky, who's been listening in part to what Sir Keir Starmer said. He was in the dry, Vicky. Rishi Sunak, we just saw him a few minutes ago, absolutely drowned. But they were both repeating their messages on this huge, momentous day.
Yeah, they are both going to be putting out the cases and how they are going to fight this general election campaign. Now, for the Prime Minister, he's going to talk about security. He's going to talk about the work he did during COVID as Chancellor, how he helped people through a difficult time. And really, the Conservatives want to talk about the future. They want to talk about the plan they have. They say they've got a plan. It's starting to work. The economy is starting to turn around. Stick with us and it's all going to be OK. Of course, Labour want to fight this election on the Conservatives' record. They don't want to forget about what happened in Downing Street with Partygate. They don't want people to forget about Liz Truss. They want to talk about the Conservatives' record in power over the last 14 years, and particularly about the economy. But I think, Sir Keir Starmer, they have so far, Labour, played it very safe. They have gone out there and talked about trust. The Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, talks a lot about trustonomics. She wants people to feel they can trust her with their money. They feel that in the past,
as well,
that there's been a sort of, a problem with Labour and the economy, that they really do want to turn that around. So you can see here how this is going to be fought. With the economy, of course, I think at the centre of this.
And just let's talk a little bit about the drama of today, because it's very wet. This was the last moment, in a way, that Rishi Sunak could call it before the summer, before effectively the schools break up and the summer holidays begin. And yet a lot of Westminster seems to have been taken by surprise. I should say I heard a tip yesterday. There was a lot of speculation, but there's been so much speculation for a long time. But I heard diaries were being cleared, and the reason partly why obviously people are still so surprised is that the Tories are so far behind, 20 points behind in the polls.
Yeah.
What is the calculation of calling it now without waiting for some potential economic improvement in the autumn?
I mean, it is unusual for a Prime Minister who is that far behind in the polls to call an election when he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to do it now. He could have waited till January next year. And also the fact he didn't choose to do it in May. The big flurry was around the May local elections. It would have been the obvious time to do it on the same day as the local elections. And once that moment had passed, I think lots of Tory MPs thought, well, now it's going to be the autumn. You're going to hope that something turns up, hope that the economy starts turning around. And then that has all changed in the last couple of days. Now, good news today on inflation. And yet on the other side of it, a lot of speculation that interest rates won't now be cut in the summer as early as many people have been hoping. And that would have been something that the government would have hoped was going to happen, that people with mortgages would have started to see those bills coming down. But if they're not going to, then it raises the question, well, what are we waiting for? We're waiting for flights to Rwanda, maybe. But what if those flights take off and then over the summer more migrants come across the channel? It will look like it hasn't worked. So there was a lot of jeopardy in waiting, as well as hoping for something to turn up.
Vicky, for now, thanks very much indeed. Well, we are joined by Charles Walker, Conservative MP. Mr. Walker, thanks for joining us. Your reaction to today's announcement?
Well, I was surprised. I have to say, we heard rumours in the tea room, but that's from Monday, but that's what we thought they were, just rumours. And it was really only this morning at about 10:30 that these rumours began to sort of gain some purchase with colleagues. And here we are just after, 5:30, nearly 6 o'clock, looking at a 6-week general election campaign.
And are you standing?
I'm not. No, I announced well over 2 years ago that I wasn't standing, but I spoke to the candidate who's fighting my seat for the Conservatives and wished him the best of luck just before coming on air with you.
And obviously, just to ask you about the drama and the optics of the moment, obviously, as you know, it's a very wet day.
Yeah.
Even the Prime Minister can't control the weather, of course. But you know, in terms of how this is going to look to voters, turning on the news, looking at a very, very, soggy Prime Minister, frankly, standing out here for quite a few minutes making that address, is that, a good way to kick off an election campaign?
To be honest, most of it will be forgotten. It's a 6-week campaign. It feels very immediate now because it's just been launched, but there are rhythms to general election campaigns. As you rightly said, the Prime Minister can choose the date of polling, but he can't choose what's happening on the weather front. So look, this is the first of 42 days. And there's going to be lots of ups and lots of downs, both for Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. I mean, it's the political fight of both men's lives. One wants to stay in number 10 and one wants to get the keys to number 10. So it's going to be a
fascinating 6 weeks.
does really want to stay?
Do you think he believes he can win this? Because the economy, some of the numbers, the inflation numbers today indicated, things potentially improving. Energy prices might have been coming down in the autumn. That is why so many who'd calculated the Conservatives' best chance said October, November, surely. So, what is your sense for your fellow Conservative MPs who want to stay in the Commons? Is this date giving them the best chance?
He clearly believes, the Prime Minister clearly believes that now is the time to go against really good inflation figures. So he's made the decision. He would not have made this decision lightly, but he thinks this is the best window in which to fight a general election campaign. And we can argue about should it be November, should it be October, should it have been May, should it have been July, but it is when it is, and it's July the 4th. And that's the contest that my colleagues are going to have to fight. The starting gun has been fired, and people now will be getting their leaflets ready, looking at their canvassing schedules, clearing their diaries, getting ready to submit their nomination papers to the returning officer, and the campaigning started as soon as he appeared on the steps of number 10.
And Mr. Walker, in terms of the key issues, the things that your constituents have been talking to you about, I know that you're not going to be fighting for your seat again, but what do you think are the key questions that the Conservatives can persuade people on?
So the Prime Minister said stick the course. We were battling against the headwinds of COVID. Then there was China pursuing zero COVID that placed inflationary pressures into the economy. Then also Russia's appalling invasion of Ukraine, creating an energy shock. And the Prime Minister is going to say, I was with you through those difficult times. The times were always going to be difficult. But I said, if I took these measures, and some of them were difficult, putting up taxes, for example, we would get back to a good footing again. And I think that's what I know that's what the basis of our general election campaign is going to be. I said we needed to stick the course, we've stuck the course, and now we're beginning to reap the dividends.
In a special programme, we'll bring you all the reactions.
Charles Walker, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And just let me update you on what happened earlier this afternoon, because we heard Rishi Sunak saying that he met the King and he met the Prime Minister at the Palace directly after a reception. The meeting lasted, according to a Palace source, that meeting lasted for about 15 minutes, and it took place on the normal Wednesday Prime Minister's audience in the usual private audience room. That's just a briefing from Buckingham Palace, the King, of course, in London at the moment. Let's listen now to Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats, for his reaction to today's announcement of an election.
Well, Liberal Democrats are fighting a really strong campaign across the country, and in many parts of the country it is the Liberal Democrats who can beat the Conservatives. We're the only party who can beat the Conservatives across the blue wall. We're here in Surrey. Everyone knows the battle here is between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. But in so many other counties and across the home counties in the southwest of England and many other places too, if people want to get rid of the Conservative MP, they need to vote Liberal Democrat, and they can get that local champion that will stand up for them.
And ended his speech
Liberal Democrats will be very hopeful of winning some Lib Dem Tory marginals. Of course, they've been tight in the past, but of course the Conservatives have struggled in the polls recently. Let's get the latest also now from the SNP leaders, John Swinney.
First of all, I'm very pleased that we have an election date. I'm looking forward enormously to leading my party into this election campaign. I set forward for the party leadership knowing that we'd have a Westminster election soon. It's a wee bit sooner than I think everybody thought, but it's welcome. It's a welcome opportunity to remove the Tory government and to put Scotland first. And that's what I'll be saying to the public. But I also have to say that I think this is perhaps the latest act of disrespect from a Conservative government to call an election during the Scottish summer school holidays. There will be schools in Scotland on holiday by the time polling day comes, and that will not have been given a moment's thought by the Tory election planners. It shows the contempt the Tories have for Scotland.
So John Swinney there, the SNP leader, as the UK is now plunged into a general election. There's been immense amounts of speculation about it. Just yesterday I heard talk that meetings were being cancelled in the building behind me, diaries were being cleared for this afternoon, and a potential general election was going to be announced, and that is exactly what has happened. Rishi Sunak came out here in the last hour, standing in the rain, making a fairly long speech for a few minutes, outlining his push to the country to secure the public vote. It comes, of course, at the end of 14 years of Conservative government, with Labour very well ahead in the polls. So Keir Starmer sounding optimistic, but of course it is now up to the campaigners and the public to cast their vote on July the 4th. More coming up on BBC News.
Today at 6, we are live in Downing Street as Rishi Sunak calls a general election for the 4th of July. Speaking less than an hour ago in the pouring rain, he said he had a plan for the future and it was up to the people to make a decision.
Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future. To decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty.
On the 4th of July, you have the choice. And together, we can stop the chaos, we can turn the page, we can start to rebuild Britain and change our country. Thank you.
In a special programme, we'll bring you all the reaction from here in Downing Street and across the UK.
I'm really pleased to hear that we are having a general election. I think it's about time that people actually bother to go out and vote, though. That's the big thing. People need to get to the voting stations.
And stay with us here on BBC News for continuing coverage and analysis from our team of correspondents in the UK and around the world.
Good evening from Downing Street. In a special extended 6 o'clock news, we are on for an hour because the Prime Minister has announced that there will be a general election for Thursday, the 4th of July. It ends months of speculation over when the United Kingdom would go to the polls. Battling against the rain and loud music, Mr Sunak said he was proud of what had been achieved and said it was the moment for Britain to choose its future and that he would fight for every vote. The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said this was the moment the country needs and has been waiting for. He said that Labour had a long-term plan to rebuild Britain, and he ended his speech by saying that we can change our country. In a moment, I'll be speaking to our political editor, Chris Mason. But first, let's hear what the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, had to say.
Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future. To decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
Well, Chris is indeed here with me. Chris, a momentous day for any Prime Minister, this.
Yeah, they are some of the most powerful words that you hear from a Prime Minister when they make that decision, for the power lies with them up until you get to the legal point where Parliament is going to dissolve and the election is going to happen, and we were well away from that. That could have carried on until December. Our Prime Minister has the capacity to surprise, and let me tell you this evening, there'll be surprise around the UK as people are watching our conversation. There is surprise from people here too, including in government and including in the wider Conservative Party, because there had been a sense that it looked more likely that the election might come in the autumn, that the Prime Minister might want to have a guarantee of 2 years in Downing Street before that appointment with the electorate. But instead, a conclusion reached by people behind that door, a very small collection of advisors around the Prime Minister, that their best chance was to go now. We had a little snippet there from the Prime Minister
in
making
the pouring
the case.
rain, Chris, and with music blaring out, not happy circumstances to make this.
No, indeed. Everyone in Downing Street has had an involuntary hair wash, you and me included. The brollies have been well worked through. The campaigners have been at the end there in Whitehall blaring out their music. And it's a reminder, isn't it, of the noise and the argument and the passion
and the things you can't control.
Exactly. And the fact that we're going to head into this period where Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer and leaders from the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democrats and others will be making plenty of arguments. So that is just beginning after quite the most extraordinary afternoon of politics, of announcement of weather, and of news that the election is coming. The lectern in place, cameras poised, and in the last hour, the Prime Minister calling a general election.
In the last 5 years, our country has fought through the most challenging times since the Second World War. As I stand here as your Prime Minister, I can't help but reflect that my first proper introduction to you was just over 4 years ago. I stood behind one of the podiums, upstairs in the building behind me. I told you that we faced a generation-defining moment, and that we as a society would not be judged by some government action, but by the small acts of kindness that we showed one another. You met that challenge, and then some, and I have never been prouder to be British. And when I introduced the furlough scheme, I did so not because I saw a country simply in need of desperate help, albeit we were, but because I saw a country whose future hung in the balance. I could be bold and trust in the tens of millions of you at home that you would rise to the moment, or I could accept the inevitable millions of job losses and pick up the pieces. In truth, it was no choice at all. I have never and will never leave the people of this country to face the darkest of days alone, and you know that because you've seen it. As I did then, I will forever do everything in my power to provide you with the strongest possible protection I can. That is my promise to you. I came to office, above all, to restore economic stability. Economic stability is the bedrock of any future success, whether that is rising wages and good jobs, investment in our public services, or the defence of the country. And because of our collective sacrifice and your hard work, we have reached 2 major milestones in delivering that stability, showing that when we work together, anything is possible. Our economy is now growing faster than anyone predicted, outpacing Germany, France, and the United States. And this morning it was confirmed that inflation is back to normal. This means that the pressure on prices will ease and mortgage rates will come down. This is proof that the plan and priorities I set out are working. I recognise that it has not always been easy. Some of you will only just be starting to feel the benefits, and for some, it might still be hard when you look at your bank balance. But this hard-earned economic stability was only ever meant to be the beginning. The question now is how and who do you trust to turn that foundation into a secure future for you, your family, and our country. Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future, to decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
the music blaring, the rain pouring, and more from Rishi Sunak.
This election will take place at a time when the world is more dangerous than it has been since the end of the Cold War. And these uncertain times call for a clear plan and bold action to chart a course to a secure future. You must choose in this election who has that plan, who is prepared to take the bold action necessary to secure a better future for our country and our children. Now, I cannot and will not claim that we have got everything right. No government should. But I am proud of what we have achieved together, the bold actions we have taken, and I'm confident about what we can do in the future. I hope that my work since I became Prime Minister shows that we have a plan and are prepared to take bold action necessary for our country to flourish. Now, I've stuck with that plan and always been honest with you about what is needed, even when that's been difficult. Because I'm guided by doing what is right for our country, not what is easy. Over the next few weeks, I will fight for every vote. I will earn your trust, and I will prove to you that only a Conservative government led by me will not put our hard-earned economic stability at risk, can restore pride and confidence in our country, and with a clear plan and bold action, will deliver a secure future for you, your family, and our United Kingdom.
So this is it, a general election is on. Power will leave this most powerful of streets, and you'll be able to decide whether he stays or whether he goes. The Cabinet had been summoned for a meeting to confirm what had become the talk of Westminster. Parliament would be dissolved, campaigns would begin, and tonight they're already underway.
Now, it will feel like a long campaign, I'm sure of that. But no matter what else is said and done, that opportunity for change is what this election is about.
It's a welcome opportunity to remove the Tory government and to put Scotland first. And that's what I'll be saying to the public. But I also have to say that I think this is perhaps the latest act of disrespect from a Conservative government to call an election during the Scottish summer school holidays.
Well, in so many parts of the country, it's the Liberal Democrats who can beat the Conservatives. And I think people are crying out for change. And they want to vote for someone who would champion them, their family and their community.
And so the noise, the arguments, the persuasion begins. And then it's over to you to decide who governs the UK for the next 5 years.
Well, Chris and I are joined by our economics editor, Faisal Islam, but I should just first say that no fault of Chris's, but the sound quality on that piece was a bit affected by the weather, so apologies for that. Chris, we have weeks of campaigning now. What's the shape of the campaign going to be like?
I think the likely contours, certainly in terms of the battle between the Conservatives and Labour, is, as you might imagine, after a long period of a party being in government as far as the Conservatives are concerned. So we will hear from Rishi Sunak and other Conservatives an argument about stability, an argument that suggests, do you really trust this as a moment for change? And from Labour, change will be the word that they come back to again and again. Why? Because change is the most powerful word in politics if, and it's an if people are reassured that that is a change they are tempted to turn to. And so when I speak to senior figures in the Labour Party and indeed in the Conservatives and elsewhere, the recurring message that they come back to me with when they do focus groups speaking to people about how they might be motivated to vote is one that is reflected from many, that after a long period in government there is a desire for people to have a say, and the most recurrent thing that people say is often, maybe this is that moment for a change. So from Labour's perspective, that is what you can expect them to seize on. They're already seizing on it tonight. So that's the battle, if you like, between the Conservatives and Labour as to the main party in government the other side of the July election. But of course there's a whole host of other contests going on as well. How might the Scottish National Party perform in Scotland, for so long so dominant? Opinion polls suggesting there Labour are competitive again. That could prove crucial in the arithmetic that we'll be looking at are on election night. Of course, you've got the Liberal Democrats as well, also hoping to be in a stronger position than they have been in recent years. There's the Northern Ireland parties, the Green Party, Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalists. So that flotilla of election arguments is just setting sail tonight, and at some points it will feel like a frenetic 6 weeks, at other points it might feel like a long 6 weeks, but it'll be a profoundly significant 6 weeks or so as the country decides who it would like to live behind that black door in the second week of July, the other side of the general election.
We'll be hearing a little bit more about that flotilla in the nations in just a moment. But Faisal, the announcement today coincides with inflation coming down to 2.3%. How much of a factor will that have been in what we heard today?
Well, I don't think it was a coincidence. It was very much done on purpose. And wow, to peg your election date or the announcement of that date to a figure. I mean, if it had come in a little bit higher, would they not have done what they've done today? They don't know the number till this morning. What jeopardy? But it's not just that figure. We should first say about the inflation number. It has come down to normal levels. It was at 11% a year and a half ago. They seek some credit for that. It's worth saying or clarifying that, you know, when it went up to 11%, that was definitely due to global factors according to the government, but they do want this credit now. It has gone down to 2%, which wasn't ordained. It might not have fallen to what are normal levels close to the Bank of England target. But in truth, if they were trying to peg it to that number, it didn't fall quite in the way they would have hoped, because underlying measures of inflation, the service sector inflation, that stayed quite high. And that means that if they were counting on the Bank of England giving a nice present to an incumbent government, which is cutting interest rates in the middle of this campaign, that is now deemed to be less likely than expectations only this morning. So we wait. We're not certain of what will happen on June the 20th. But at the moment, it's not looking likely that we'll get a cut, but maybe we will get a cut in the months afterwards, though that would be after the election campaign. The other bit of data, of course, was the fact we came out of recession. It proved to be a mild recession at the end of last year, and that figure was stronger than expected. But what you can see by that, what you can deduce from his speech as well, is that for the Prime Minister, this is a campaign rooted in economics. When you talk to the shadow team, they also say they want to fight the election on the economy. So you have this fundamental issue of perception, which is the government wants credit for a turning point. And the opposition want to say, well, if the economy had to have a turning point, then they should get blamed for it going down. And then there's a bigger point, which is even though you can see some of these numbers starting to stabilise and to turn, do people feel that change? And I think in truth, when I talk to people in the cabinet involved in economics, I get the sense that if you were going to call this election purely on economics, you probably might have waited till the autumn, because that would have given an opportunity for potentially a tax cut, another budget type event. That's not what's happened, but he still wants to talk a lot about the economy. He wants people to think that the government, this Prime Minister, has steered the economy through three massive global crises, whereas the opposition clearly want to say, well, some of the blame for what we've seen lies with the government. That's the fundamental dynamic here.
Very good to talk to you. Thank you very much, Faisal, Chris, and we'll have more from you later in the programme. But now let's get some reaction from across the UK. We'll be hearing from Sarah Girvin in Belfast and Thomas Morgan in Cardiff. But first, let's go to our Scotland editor, James Cook, who's in Edinburgh for us now. James.
Yes, good evening. Well, it's rainy here as well, I can tell you that much. And this election, whether rain or shine, is going to be fought in a different electoral landscape in Scotland. A lot of the constituencies have changed since the last election in 2019 because of boundaries being withdrawn, a lot of them even created afresh. We heard briefly there from the SNP leader, John Swinney, just a little bit more of the message that the SNP are putting out this evening. They say that this is the moment to remove the Tory government and, in their words, put Scotland first by voting SNP. They say the SNP offers a better future to what they call the broken Westminster consensus. I expect we'll hear more of that sort of talk during this election campaign. But the SNP themselves are also under quite a lot of pressure. The Scottish National Party has dominated politics here for well over a decade. Under Alex Salmond and then Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP notched up victory after victory. Even after Scotland had voted against independence, the wins kept coming. At the last general election in 2019, the SNP won 48 seats in Scotland. The Conservatives took 6, the Liberal Democrats 4, while Labour returned just 1 MP. But in the past year, polls suggest a swing in support from the SNP to Labour, especially in Scotland's central belt, where the party won the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election. So what do voters here make of going back to the ballot box?
I don't know. I really don't. I've no confidence in any of them. So I don't know.
As we're getting older, things are getting worse. They say, oh, it's for the better, but a lot is not, you know. So health service, school system, everything, you know, it's just not right the way it should be.
I feel it's long overdue, to be honest, because I feel things are getting a bit stagnating just now. Nothing seems to be changing. If anything, just seem to be getting worse all the time. So, yes, I would welcome a general election. The sooner the better.
For the SNP, there's been change at the top too. Hamza Yousaf has come and gone as leader, replaced just a fortnight ago by John Swinney. So, what are the big issues likely to be in this general election here in Scotland? Well, aside from the economy, voters tell pollsters that the things they are really interested in are the health service, housing and education. Now, they are all devolved to the Scottish Parliament here, but that doesn't mean they're irrelevant in a general election, because the overall budget that the Scottish Government gets to spend is shaped in Westminster. That's the picture here. Over now to my colleague Thomas Morgan in Cardiff.
Yeah, well, the Welsh Labour leader Vaughan Gething has said the people of Wales want a change, and they're calling for a change at UK government level and an end to the Tory chaos. And as the campaigns begin across the UK, no doubt in Wales, it'll be focused in North Wales, and that is where the Tories took 5 of their 6 seats from Labour. But those seats and the constituencies in Wales will look remarkably different in July, as 40 seats become 32 due to those electoral boundary changes. And the only seat that's not changing at all is on the Isle of Anglesey, which today was announced as the preferred site for a new nuclear power plant, and it will be a target seat for Labour after they lost it 4.5 years ago. And what do those electoral boundary changes mean for the likes of Plaid Cymru and Lib Dems as well? Well, they look to take advantage of that. Some political experts have said that it could benefit Labour more than any other party. Now, Plaid Cymru's leader, Reeta has said that his party is the only one that would put Wales first and look for more money, while Jane Dodds, the Welsh Lib Dem leader, has said that there's no difference between red and blue. You'll get nothing new there at all. And the Welsh Tory leader has attacked Welsh Labour on their record on health and education. Let's cross over now to Belfast, to Sarah Girvin.
Well, most of Northern Ireland's Westminster seats are split between the 2 big parties here. The Democratic Unionist Party has 8 and Sinn Féin has 7. There will be 18 seats up for grabs overall. And when Northern Ireland's power sharing executive got back up and running again just earlier this year after a 2-year hiatus, it did so with Sinn Féin as the largest party and Michelle O'Neill as First Minister for the first time. Now, that's a success they will be looking to recreate at Westminster, even though Sinn Féin has an abstentionist policy, which means its MPs do not take their seats. And it could be argued this is really bad timing for the DUP. Its former leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, stepped down in March after he was charged with rape and 10 other historic sexual offences. Now, he is denying all of those, but his solicitor confirmed today he would not be seeking re-election. And so the DUP's new leader, Gavin Robinson, now faces the prospect of leading his party into a general election for the first time while defending his own seat, just a matter of weeks into a new job. As is often the case in Northern Ireland, Reeta, there is a lot in the mix.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. That's Sarah Girvin in Belfast. Thomas Morgan reporting for us from Cardiff, and James Cook in Edinburgh. Thank you all very much for speaking to us in this extended 1-hour-long 6 o'clock news. Well, as protocol dictates, the Prime Minister had to inform the King of his plans and ask him to dissolve Parliament. That's the official term for closing Parliament ahead of an election. Our royal correspondent Sarah Campbell is outside Buckingham Palace for us now. And Sarah, I understand that the Palace has spoken since the Prime Minister's announcement.
Yes, indeed, Rita. Anyone hoping to see the pictures of the Prime Minister's car leaving, being tracked by helicopters, coming here to the palace, and then pictures of him meeting with the King on this very important constitutional moment, will, I'm afraid, be disappointed, because it already happened earlier this afternoon, and we found out because the Prime Minister talked about it in his statement. As I say, it's one of the King's really most important constitutional duties. It is, of course, the first time he has carried it out after his mother, the late Queen, did so many times over so many years. This is what we know, that the King had been hosting a reception for the Prince's Trust Awards in Buckingham Palace this afternoon. And when that finished, he met with the Prime Minister for around about 15 minutes. It would be very interesting to know exactly how that conversation carried out. But of course, we will never know. Those conversations are not divulged. But as the Prime Minister said outside Downing Street, he informed the King of his decision to call a general election, and the King agreed the request for the dissolution of Parliament. So what happens now going forward? The King effectively takes no further part in the election itself. He will, of course, welcome the new Prime Minister when it's all done and dusted. But there will be changes to his schedule and that of the royal family. If I can just let you know what a palace spokesperson has said in the last few minutes. The royal family will, in accordance with normal procedure, postpone engagements that may appear to divert attention or distract from the election campaign. Their Majesties send their sincere apologies to any of those who may be affected as a result. So shorthand to that, there will be engagements that will carry on, but they will be perhaps different to the diary at the moment. And so the royal household will be working out what can and can't go ahead.
Thank you very much. Sarah Campbell there. Well, there are 650 MPs sitting in Westminster, elected from across the UK. And this is how things look right now. But of course, this picture could appear very different after July the 4th. So what has been the reaction from voters? Gloucester voted Labour from 1997 to 2005 and has been a Conservative seat ever since then. Our correspondent Phil Mackey has been there this afternoon.
It's time. After all those elections in the 2010s, it's the first of this decade. But outside the Westminster bubble, it came as a big surprise.
Really?
Yeah.
Can't believe it. Gosh.
Why not?
Well, it's out of the blue, isn't it? So I thought it was the autumn.
I guess it's not a lot of time for people to put together campaigns to get across their ideas and to market everything like that. But yeah, he's obviously felt the need. People probably aren't happy with the way things are going, so.
The only good thing is I run a village hall and they put the polling station in our village hall, so it helps us.
In the tall ship, the telly wasn't working, so we had to improvise. The big announcement didn't draw a crowd, nor much of an enthusiastic reaction.
I'm surprised it's been announced today, to be honest. I thought he would leave it a bit longer or as long as possible. But if it's going to be July, I think that's about right.
I don't think there's much optimism about for anything being any different after one than before one, but I think things have been so awful for so long, it'd be a good idea if we had one.
On the day they called the election in 1997, Tony Blair came to Gloucester and launched his election campaign. They won the seat, they won the general election, but since 2005, it's been held again by the Conservatives. It's why a seat like this has become such an important battleground. In the end, the Prime Minister didn't cut things as fine as he could have done, but is there ever an ideal time?
Is it the right time for election? In all honesty, I don't, like, as much as I think he's doing a bad job, but I don't think he's had long enough, really. In politics and stuff, if you're promising stuff, you've got to keep up with it, you've got to be really quick about it.
And a real-life Taylor of Gloucester is hoping for big alterations.
Well, the society is not very well, actually. If you look at the NHS and then the social care, economy. Those three is the main, my main topics really is they have to find a solution for it.
Maybe it was the drab weather, but there wasn't much enthusiasm today. The parties have 6 weeks to change that. Phil Mackey, BBC News, Gloucester.
Well, it's been an eventful 4.5 years since the last election, including 3 Conservative Prime Ministers. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth takes us through the big moments since the election in 2019.
With a clear plan and bold action, will deliver a secure future for you, your family, and our United Kingdom.
Announcing the election, the 3rd Prime Minister since the country last had a say.
I am determined to deliver.
His predecessor lasted just 49 days in the job.
Thank you all very much.
The one before was in office a little longer. Back in 2019, Boris Johnson swept to power with the party's biggest majority in decades.
We did it! We did it! We pulled it off, didn't we?
He pulled together Tory voters from unexpected corners of the country under the banner of Brexit.
With this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what?
For Labour, it was a dismal result, losing in their traditional heartlands.
Mr Corbyn, this is the worst Labour defeat in decades. Why are you not resigning today?
Right. Are we here?
His top team was buoyed by victory.
And I want to thank you all for your hard work in getting this government re-elected and backed by 109 new Conservatives.
But it wasn't long until the COVID pandemic became the country's priority, taking lives and liberties.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Then the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, played a central role in the government's response, crafting the furlough and Eat Out to Help Out schemes. But as well as rules being made, they were also being broken, and the scandal around Downing Street parties was instrumental in Boris Johnson's downfall.
Hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
After a contest, Conservative Party members picked Liz Truss over Rishi Sunak to be their next leader and the country's next Prime Minister.
Thank you for putting your faith in me.
Her tenure was short-lived after the economic turmoil caused by the mini-budget. Enter Rishi Sunak, attempting to bring stability.
I understand too that I have work to do to restore trust after all that has happened.
He set out his priorities with promises on small boats, the economy and the NHS. But so far, it seems, they've failed to revive his party's ailing political fortunes. Still, the 3rd Conservative Prime Minister since the last general election has now decided it's time the country does have its say. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, what can the current state of the polls tell us about the likely outcome of this general election? Time to turn to our resident polling expert, Professor Sir John Curtis. And Sir John, what are the challenges as you see them and as the polls suggest for each of the parties?
Well, the most obvious and immediate challenge is for the Conservative Party. As things stand at the moment, on average in the polls, and there are differences between the pollsters, but on average they put the Conservatives 21 points behind at the moment. Even the best of them put them at least around 16 points behind. And however you look at it, that is an outcome that would result in Labour being elected with an overall majority. So the challenge facing Rishi Sunak is to try to overturn that very, very substantial Labour lead. And frankly, apart from John Major in 1997, no Prime Minister has called an election so far behind. And so he's going to have to beat the cephalological records if indeed he's going to win this election. That doesn't mean to say that Labour is without its challenges. The competition for the support of those who are unhappy with the Conservatives, actually Labour these days faces competition from reform. Now, in the sense, if voters go for Conservative reform, Labour tend to benefit in terms of winning seats. But it does indicate that for some of the people, indeed quite a lot of the people who are unhappy with the current Conservative government, at present at least, they don't necessarily regard Labour as the answer. They're looking to reform. Labour also have to worry a little bit about the Greens, who did well in the local elections. They're at the highest in this parliament in terms of opinion polls. And it's pretty clear that where the Greens do well, it's Labour that suffer. Now, maybe we're only talking about 1 or 2 constituencies here, but still there is a challenge for Labour there. The other party, apart from the Conservatives, for whom this election is going to be a challenge above all, however, is the Scottish National Party north of the border, because, as you all know, they have just changed their leader. Humza Yousaf eventually had to resign in the wake of his attempt to end the agreement with the Greens that helped to keep the SNP in power in the Scottish Parliament. That all ended rather unhappily for him. John Swinney has just got his feet under the table. His party, 5-6 points behind Labour in the polls, faces the risk of losing their position as the third largest party inside the House of Commons. And now he's finding that rather than having the autumn as an opportunity to be able to turn things around, he's got to turn them around very, very quickly indeed. The Liberal Democrats, well, their position in the national polls is not particularly good. It's only around 10%, not even as good as they got last time. They are hoping that the polls are right and the message of the local elections are right, that the Conservatives are indeed in deep electoral trouble. That continues to be the case in July, and they are hoping that however few votes they get nationally, they will be able to pick up the constituencies where they start off second from the Conservatives, not least perhaps because some Labour voters might help them along the way. But the challenge for them is to indeed actually deliver on that strategy which they have decided to focus on.
Professor Sir John Curtis, thank you very much as always, and we'll be hearing much more from you in the weeks to come. Let's take a look at the other stories making the news today. And the former chief executive of the Post Office, Paula Venables, has been in tears at the public inquiry into the IT scandal. She admitted that she'd made mistakes, but she denied that there'd been a conspiracy to cover up problems with the Horizon system. Ms. Venables, who was chief executive from 2012 to 2019, apologised to sub-postmasters after hundreds were wrongly prosecuted when faulty technology made it appear that money was missing from their branches. Our business correspondent Emma Simpson was at the inquiry.
They were disturbing, didn't you, Miss?
Paula Venables has come to face the music, but she first had to get past the cameras.
Anything to say at all to the people who suffered so bravely?
To finally explain her role in the scandal. It's been a long time coming for the sub-postmasters whose lives have been wrecked.
Why? Why has she let this go on?
Did she put profits before people is the big question.
It's important that the truth is there, that she's allowed to speak, that she can put over what she, was seeing at the time.
I swear by Almighty God.
Sworn in, this part-time priest is then given a warning about self-incrimination.
Do you understand all that?
Thank you, Suin, and I plan to answer all the questions.
But there were also tears and apologies for what she said.
The Post Office knew that. I completely accepted. Personally, I didn't know that, and I'm incredibly sorry that that happened to those people and to so many others.
But what did she know and when?
Was there a conspiracy at the Post Office which lasted for nearly 12 years, involving a wide range of people, differing over time, to deny you information and to deny you documents and to falsely give you reassurance?
No, I don't believe that was the case.
Under her leadership, a lot of evidence emerged about flaws with Horizon, but at key points, she says she wasn't aware of much of it, including crucial legal advice.
Do you think you're the unluckiest CEO in the United Kingdom?
I was too trusting. I did probe and I did ask questions. And I'm disappointed where information wasn't shared.
But former Royal Mail boss and colleague Dame Moya Green isn't so sure. The inquiry has shown a text chat between both of them earlier this year. "I think you knew," says Moya, to which Paula replies, "That isn't the case." Moya then asks, How could you not have known? Before saying, I've supported you all these years, adding, I can't support you now. And then she was asked about the case of sub-postmaster Martin Griffiths, who took his own life after the post office ruined him.
And I imagine that, I'm sorry, I imagine that I was probably...
Just pause.
Yes, OK.
Try and compose yourself if you can, and then continue your evidence, please.
Thank you.
She apologised to Alan Bates too. She said he was right to persevere.
I wonder about these apologies. These are just words. I mean, the big problem at the moment is trying to get money out for the victims in all of this. And anything that does that will make the real difference rather than a few words.
And here's another thing. When Paula Venables first joined the post office in 2007 as a director, she said it was another 5 years before she found out they did their own private prosecutions. And the inquiry heard that when she left her job in 2019, she still believed there hadn't been any miscarriages of justice. Her thinking and decision-making will be tested again tomorrow. Emma Simpson, BBC News.
Ireland, Norway and Spain have announced that they will formally recognise a Palestinian state from next week. Spain and Ireland said the decision was not against Israel nor in favour of Hamas, but rather in support of peace. Israel has reacted angrily and recalled its ambassadors to the three countries. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale explains the background and the history.
Most of the world thinks there is such a thing as a Palestinian state, something that Yasser Arafat declared unilaterally back in 1988. Earlier this month, in a vote at the United Nations, 143 countries supported a Palestinian attempt to join the UN, something that only states can do. But this has always been vetoed by the United States and other countries which say the Palestinians should get a state only as part of a long-term political deal with Israel known as a two-state solution. Now, currently, only 9 European countries recognise a Palestinian state, many of which did so as long ago as 1988. They will now be joined by Norway, Ireland and Spain, who say they want to support a political pathway towards peace in the Middle East.
Recognition is an act of powerful political and symbolic value. It is an expression of our view that Palestine holds and should be able to vindicate the full rights of a state, including self-determination, self-governance, territorial integrity and security.
Now, crucially, they hope this will help get a ceasefire and the hostages released.
We will recognise the state of Palestine so that when the time comes, the state of Palestine will also have the same status as the Israeli government and thus be able to empower the future Palestinian Authority in the face of Hamas, a terrorist group that must obviously disappear if we want peace.
Palestinian leaders welcomed the announcement. Hamas claimed it was prompted by what it called its resistance. Israel's government was furious, saying the decision rewarded terrorism.
This is not the place nor the time now to come and unilaterally recognise a Palestinian state. Such things should only be determined through direct negotiations and not in a unilateral way. And any such decision harms Israeli sovereignty and Israeli security, and we will not allow it.
So what does this mean in practice? Well, the decision will put some pressure on other European countries to follow suit. But many believe that this is too early, that recognising a Palestinian state should come later to drive momentum towards a long-term political settlement, and we're a long way from that. There are also many unanswered questions. What would the border of a Palestinian state be? Would Jerusalem be the capital? So the diplomatic dial has been shifted with these symbolic declarations, but the reality for Palestinians on the ground is unlikely to change.
Rainfall in the UK over the last few months was 20% heavier because of human-produced greenhouse gases. That is according to scientists at the World Weather Attribution Group. When the Prime Minister came out here to make his statement today, he was frankly drenched, and there is more heavy rain expected today, with flood warnings issued for many parts of the country. Our climate editor Justin Rolat is in Worcestershire to tell us more.
Well, I am outside the home of somebody who used concrete, the most widely used material on Earth apart from water, to protect his lovely home from those winter floods, Rita. He used it to build this formidable wall, and just look how effective it was. But did you know that concrete is one of the most polluting materials on Earth? It's responsible for about 8% of total CO2 emissions. The good news is a team from Cambridge University has come up with an ingenious process which could just massively reduce the emissions from concrete. Concrete is everywhere, but it is very polluting. Making the cement that binds it all together produces lots of CO2. A team from Cambridge University have a plan to sidestep all of that polluting chemistry by reactivating this stuff, used cement. Now, it has been done before in cement kilns. The Cambridge breakthrough was to realise they could piggyback on another heavy industry, steel recycling. The electric arc furnaces used for steel recycling are hot enough and can be powered with renewable energy. And the composition of used cement is almost exactly the same as chemicals steelmakers add to their furnaces to stop impurities. So using it instead could cut costs and reduce emissions for steelmakers too. But will the process work?
That's the first sample of low-carbon Portland cement produced in electric arc furnace. Ever.
So this is a world first?
This is a world first.
He believes it could mark the beginning of a revolution.
If you can make the cement with no carbon, that means we can keep on living with all the stuff we expect. It's quite important to be able to make cement with no carbon in the future.
The first full-scale trials will be in Cardiff later this week. The hope is this low-carbon cement could meet up to a quarter of UK demand. And because so much steel is now recycled, the process could be rolled out all over the world, massively reducing emissions from one of the world's most polluting materials. Justin Rolat, BBC News.
Scotland's manager Steve Clarke has announced his provisional squad for this year's Euros in Germany this summer. They take on the hosts in the opening match in Munich on the 14th of June. Chris McLaughlin has more.
They're the men who gave Scotland memories to savour during qualifying. The players who shocked Norway in Oslo, saw off Georgia in the rain before putting two past Spain. A group who allowed the nation to believe once more. So, with less than a month to go, who is on the plane to Germany? Today, the thoughts of the man making the call.
It really is beginning to feel real now, isn't it? Is that how you feel?
Yeah, I've been waiting quite a long time for this day, to be honest, since the March camp. It's been a bit of a drag.
Ben Doak, first of all, I suspect that's going to be an inclusion that's going to excite a lot of people.
Ben's one of those players that, as a coach, you watch a game and you think, oh, he's got something. That boy's got a chance. He's obviously got blistering pace, which hits you in the eye straight away.
Another player that I know that many people were, over the past few weeks, were really hoping that you would include as James Forrest, and he is a player who just never gives up.
I think a great example to every professional player is James Forrest, and his performances in recent weeks have grabbed my attention because he's scoring goals, he's creating goals, he's working up and down the line, he looks as fit as he ever looked.
What do you think, I'm not asking you for any huge predictions, but what do you think success would look like for this group in Germany?
Success is difficult to say that would be success. What we can say is that if we come out the group stage, then we'll have created a little bit of history for Scottish football. So that's a starting point. I think once you come out, if you're good enough to come out the group stage and you get the points to come out the group stage, then who knows what can happen after that.
Who knows indeed, but his optimism is shared by the 200,000 Scots expected to travel. Chris McLaughlin, BBC News.
Now to the remarkable story of the Conservative MP Craig McKinley, who's received a standing ovation on his first appearance at the House of Commons since his hands and feet were amputated because of sepsis. He was taken ill last September and placed in a coma for 16 days. In Parliament, he thanked his family and the NHS staff who saved his life, as well as the Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle and the Prime Minister for visiting him in hospital. And now to other news. Well, we're here at Downing Street in the rain, as you can see, where a short time ago the Prime Minister announced a general election, ending months of speculation. Here's what happened next. Parliament will be dissolved next week, with the election campaign getting into full swing. Polling date will be on Thursday, the 4th of July. New Parliament will meet for the first time the following Tuesday. And the official state opening of Parliament, with all the pomp and ceremony that comes with it, is scheduled for July the 17th. Well, here is the moment that Rishi Sunak made the announcement an hour or so ago.
Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future, to decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
Prime Minister speaking here just a few moments ago. Well, as we mentioned earlier, positive news about the UK economy has prompted today's election announcement, and that includes the latest figures showing that inflation has fallen to 2.3% compared with the same time last year. That is the lowest rate at which prices are rising in almost 3 years, with lower gas and electricity prices behind the drop. Well, our economics editor Faisal Islam reports now from East Sussex.
On Rustington High Street, shoppers can feel that inflation is calming, but the feel-good factor that the Prime Minister will depend on in a general election remains elusive.
I don't know, some products are going up, some products are plateauing. It's just, it's just a difficult time for everybody.
I think everything's still going up. It is just going up slightly less fast than it was.
Gas and electric prices have gone down a little bit from last year, so that's a help. You tend to shop around, you perhaps try the budget supermarkets.
Well, some things are still going up, unfortunately, but there we are. What can you do about it?
Headline inflation has now come down sharply from double-digit highs in 2022 to in April falling close to the Bank of England's target of 2%, as you can see. In the service sector, while it didn't get so high, it for now looks stuck, just about falling below 6% today. This is driven by an actual decline in energy prices, including gas going sharply negative, but you can see some other areas remain higher, like car insurance or hairdressing. Overall, some doubts now that there'll be a rate cut next month. So the big election question, how much of a change in the British economic weather has there been?
This will be an election defined by economics, called on the day of some big economic numbers, where both main parties say they do want to fight it on the economy. The government will argue that today's number and the growth number too will show an economy at a turning point after 3 years of global price shocks. The opposition will argue there's some blame for the government in those price shocks and that the public doesn't feel much of a turning point themselves.
Too hot for me, actually.
The mixed picture is reflected back in East Sussex, where Phil and Teresa are amongst the millions paying the cost of a recent remortgage.
I think, to be honest, the interest rates for us was the biggest hit because you have a pool of money that comes in every month, and normally you kind of set a bit aside and say, you know, that's what we'll have for our holidays, or that's what we'll have, like I say, for our takeaways, etc. But a big part of that chunk was just gone.
We fixed for 5 years this time. Previously, we've only ever done like 2 years. But because of it was going up and up and up, we wanted to know where we stood for the next 5 years because it could have gone up higher.
On the country's high streets, the price shock of the past 3 years is beginning to ebb away. Whether British families feel that and who gets the credit is the key economic battleground for who gets to Downing Street. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
Well, with an election announced, it means the current session of Parliament is expected to come to an end on Friday, which then prevents any new laws from being passed. But there is still a lot of legislation going through the Houses of Parliament, and the government will have to decide which has priority and which doesn't get passed. With more details on this, let's join our political correspondent, Harry Farley. And Harry, is there a sense of what new legislation is at risk of not making it?
Well, Rita, you're right. There's an awful lot of government legislation still to get through. In terms of any sense of which ones will go through, I'm told there are very live conversations going on between the Conservatives and Labour at the moment, because essentially what and how many government bills get to go through depend on whether the Labour Party oppose them. You would have thought the finance bill, that contains some measures that the Chancellor announced in the budget, has to go through, so that will take up some time. But MPs will only sit for tomorrow and possibly into some of Friday, so there is very limited time left to get any other bills through. Rishi Sunak interestingly noted that he promised to make the next generation smoke-free, so you would have thought the tobacco and vaping bill might get through. But there are other key pillars of the Conservative manifesto from 2019 that still haven't passed. The Renters Reform Bill, for example, the Leasehold and Freehold Bill, the Criminal Justice Bill, that contains amendments on decriminalising abortion, it addresses drugs and knife crime, homelessness, as well as that amendment to make causing death by dangerous cycling illegal. That is all very much up in air, and the power really lies with the Labour Party in deciding which bills they will allow to pass and which ones they will oppose.
Harry Farley, thank you very much. Well, lots of political reaction, of course, to the Prime Minister's announcement. And in the last few minutes, Carla Denyer, the co-leader of the Green Party in England and Wales, said they were very pleased to have an election at last and said the party was ready.
Voters are telling us that they are really distraught by the direction the Conservatives have been taking this country in over the last 14 years. But they are not feeling at all inspired by Keir Starmer's Labour Party, and so they're really excited by the opportunity to vote Green. Our manifesto, of course, will be coming out in a few weeks, but our key priorities will be around protecting the NHS from privatisation and making sure that it's properly funded, making sure everyone has access to a secure, warm, affordable home.
Carla Denyer of the Green Party. Just a last word with our political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, the Brollies have been up and down, up and down. It's been a very wet afternoon here in Downing Street. But what can we expect now in the weeks to come in this election campaign?
We can expect noise, and we can expect persuasion, and we can expect arguments. And there's going to be a curious backdrop in the coming weeks, Rita, because we're going to have the Euros, the football tournament, underway. England and Scotland fans and others around the UK keenly watching the football. What is often a moment of unity will play out against a backdrop of argument, because we will have election debates competing with football matches, and that argument beginning, and it will continue tonight with rallies and then interviews from the Prime Minister and from Keir Starmer and from others as they start the art, they hope, of persuasion. And tonight here at Westminster there's a whole set of views. There are some Conservative MPs who are quite surprised that they managed to keep things going this long. There are others who are really angry and bemused that the Prime Minister has gone to the country early. They feel that he could have waited until the autumn. Some being pretty critical of that moment in the street where the Prime Minister frankly was soaking wet. You have the Labour Party saying that they hope that this is a moment of change. They will make an argument, I think, grounded in what they will say is a humble request for the British people to seek an alternative government. And then we'll see so many other parties making their cases too. So what have we got in the coming weeks? We will have election debates, we'll have election manifestos, those bundles of promises upon which governments are held to account. Here we go, the argument's just beginning.
Here we go. Thank you very much indeed. Chris Mason, our political editor, of course. And just a reminder that you can hear more analysis on the election from Chris and friends on the latest newscast podcast, which will be published in the next 15 minutes or so on BBC Sounds. Well, since the last election in 2019, Westminster has gone through some turbulent times. Let's look back now on just some of the most memorable moments.
And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks. And pay taxes here in London. In London.
I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
And we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
A look back on the last 4.5 years. Now it's time for a look at the weather from a very soggy Downing Street. Here's Louise Lear. Louise.
Hi there, Rita. Thank you, everybody. What a miserable May day it has been. This was actually Staffordshire, but in fact, Rothamsted Park in Hertfordshire has had most of the rainfall so far, 60 millimetres over a month's worth of rain in 24 hours. The heaviest of the rain, though, is starting to drift further north and west over the next few hours. And in actual fact, you can see how it turned quite showery across the London area. But just look at the darker blues, the heavy rain now across North Wales and northwest England. And this is where we've got an amber weather warning, which will stay in force until tomorrow lunchtime, as we are likely to see a couple of inches of rain, but maybe in some areas to higher ground in North Wales, we could see as much as 100 millimetres of rain plus, and that could produce some localised flooding. So keeping an eye on that, it's this low pressure, very slow moving at the moment. It's drifting its way steadily northwards. The wind's picking up in the northwest overnight tonight. Gusts of winds in excess of 50 miles an hour as well, and still some heavy rain to come. Now, elsewhere it stays quite cloudy. The cloud will break in a few places and allow a little bit of mistiness to form, but it won't be a cold start to our Thursday morning, 10 to 12 degrees. Now, as we go into tomorrow, grey. Outbreaks of rain gradually starting to ease away and turn a little more showery. But for many of us, it stays quite cloudy and overcast. But maybe across East Anglia down towards the London area, we could see some brightness. And as a result, temperatures perhaps peaking at around 18 degrees. Now, as we move out of Thursday into Friday, we've got this little ridge of high pressure building and quietening things down and warming things up. And I know it's bank holiday weekend, but there's another weather front waiting in the wings. So bank holiday weekend at the moment looks like a promising start. Best of the weather on Saturday, and then sunny spells and scattered showers, but a little warmer than it's been. So all in all, Rita, not looking too bad. But
live from Downing Street in London, this is BBC News. Speaking a while ago in the pouring rain, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said he had a plan for the future and it was up to the people to make a decision.
Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future. To decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty.
On the 4th of July, you have the choice. And together, we can stop the chaos, we can turn the page, we can start to rebuild Britain and change our country. Thank you.
I'm really pleased to hear that we are having a general election. I think it's about time that people actually bother to go out and vote, though. That's the big thing. People need to get to the voting stations.
Well, we'll have much more analysis and reaction for this special programme as 5 weeks of campaigning now begin. Welcome to Downing Street here for a BBC News special. Well, I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy, and here in the rain as the drizzle starts again, I'm afraid, this is where the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak stood, getting extremely wet as he announced a general election to be held on July the 4th. Well, it ends months of speculation over when the UK would actually go to the polls. He was battling against the rain, against loud music from some protesters, and Mr Sunak said he was proud of what he'd achieved, saying it was the moment for Britain to choose its future and that he would fight for every vote. Let's take a listen now to that statement that Rishi Sunak gave here outside Downing Street in the last couple of hours.
In the last 5 years, our country has fought through the most challenging times since the Second World War. As I stand here as your Prime Minister, I can't help but reflect that my first proper introduction to you was just over 4 years ago. I stood behind one of the podiums, upstairs in the building behind me. I told you that we faced a generation-defining moment and that we as a society would not be judged by some government action, but by the small acts of kindness that we showed one another. You met that challenge, and then some, and I have never been prouder to be British. And when I introduced the furlough scheme, I did so not because I saw a country simply in need of desperate help, albeit we were, but because I saw a country whose future hung in the balance. I could be bold and trust in the tens of millions of you at home that you would rise to the moment, or I could accept the inevitable millions of job losses and pick up the pieces. In truth, it was no choice at all. I have never and will never leave the people of this country to face the darkest of days alone, and you know that because you've seen it. As I did then, I will forever do everything in my power to provide you with the strongest possible protection I can. That is my promise to you. Because for so many of us, it's easy to forget the scale of what we've been through. We were hit by a pandemic that upended normal life. Who would have thought that the government would ever tell us how many times a day we could leave our homes? Then, just as we were recovering from COVID, war returned to Europe, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine sending your energy bills spiraling. I came to office, above all, to restore economic stability. Economic stability is the bedrock of any future success, whether that is rising wages and good jobs, investment in our public services, or the defence of the country. And because of our collective sacrifice and your hard work, we have reached 2 major milestones in delivering that stability, showing that when we work together, anything is possible. Our economy is now growing faster than anyone predicted, outpacing Germany, France, and the United States. And this morning it was confirmed that inflation is back to normal. This means that the pressure on prices will ease and mortgage rates will come down. This is proof that the plan and priorities I set out are working. I recognise that it has not always been easy. Some of you will only just be starting to feel the benefits, and for some, it might still be hard when you look at your bank balance. But this hard-earned economic stability was only ever meant to be the beginning. The question now is how, and who do you trust to turn that foundation into a secure future for you, your family, and our country? Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future, to decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July. This election will take place at a time when the world is more dangerous than it has been since the end of the Cold War. Putin's Russia is waging a brutal war in Ukraine and will not stop there if he succeeds. That war has also made it all too clear the risk to our energy security. In the Middle East, the forces of Islamist extremism threaten regional and ultimately global stability. These tensions are exploited by extremists who seek to undermine our values and divide our society here at home. China is looking to dominate the 21st century by stealing a lead in technology. And migration is being weaponized by hostile states to threaten the integrity of our borders. These uncertain times call for a clear plan and bold action to chart a course to a secure future. You must choose in this election who has that plan, who is prepared to take the bold action necessary to secure a better future for our country and our children. Now, I cannot and will not claim that we have got everything right. No government should. But I am proud of what we have achieved together, the bold actions we have taken, and I'm confident about what we can do in the future. We've tackled inflation, controlled debt, cut workers' taxes, and increased the state pension by £900. We've reduced taxes on investment and seized the opportunities of Brexit to make this the best country in the world to grow a business. put record amounts of funding into our NHS and ensured it is now training the doctors and nurses it needs in the decades to come. We've reformed education, and our children are now the best readers in the Western world. We prioritised energy security and your family finances over environmental dogma in our approach to net zero. We fully funded an increase in defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. We made a decision to invest more in local transport that you actually use, rather than endlessly plough more money into HS2. We set out a comprehensive plan to reform our welfare system, to make it fair for those who pay for it as well as those who need it. Immigration is finally coming down, and we are stopping the boats with our Rwanda partnership. And we will ensure that the next generation grows up smoke-free. I hope that my work since I became Prime Minister shows that we have a plan and are prepared to take bold action necessary for our country to flourish. Now, I've stuck with that plan and always been honest with you about what is needed, even when that's been difficult. Because I'm guided by doing what is right for our country, not what is easy. Now, I can't say the same thing for the Labour Party, because I don't know what they offer. And in truth, I don't think you know either. And that's because they have no plan. There is no bold action. And as a result, the future can only be uncertain with them. On the 5th of July, either Keir Starmer or I will be Prime Minister. He has shown time and time again that he will take the easy way out and do anything to get power. If he was happy to abandon all the promises he made to become Labour leader once he got the job, how can you know that he won't do exactly the same thing if he were to become Prime Minister? If you don't have the conviction to stick to anything you say, if you don't have the courage to tell people what you want to do, and if you don't have a plan, how can you possibly be trusted to lead our country, especially at this most uncertain of times? Over the next few weeks, I will fight for every vote. I will earn your trust, and I will prove to you that only a Conservative government led by me will not put our hard-earned economic stability at risk, can restore pride and confidence in our country, and with a clear plan and bold action, will deliver a secure future for you, your family, and our United Kingdom.
The Prime Minister confirming the speculation of the last few hours with that general election announcement on July the 4th. Damien Grammaticus, our political correspondent, is here. Damien, I'm just going to confess to a bit of political gossip here, because I heard a very strong tip yesterday, early evening, I guess I heard, but it had been doing the rounds, I think, for the day, that meetings were being cancelled and that something was afoot. Now, we've had so much speculation, we've had so much sort of electioneering by all the party leaders. In a way, is it a relief to everyone in Westminster that finally we know the date?
I think it's a relief to some, certainly. I mean, probably more of a relief, if you like, to all of those watching, the journalists, the media, and the crowd around Westminster, and have been sort of speculating about this for months and months. Less of a relief to some MPs, particularly some Conservative MPs. Some of them have been saying to me in the last hour or two that they would not have called it now. They're not sure, not sure of the reasoning for this, not sure they're convinced that they would have done the same thing. So there is some nervousness there about Rishi Sunak calling it early, but of course, everyone else, as you say, there was sort of speculation. I mean, there's been speculation for weeks and weeks. It kept bubbling up and dying down. Last couple of days, people saying that they'd been hearing from senior, people in the cabinet, the Prime Minister's election advisors and people, that no, it wasn't going to be happening soon after the summer. And of course, today that all bubbled up again. Why today? Well, particularly the economic news today. In news that inflation had come down, and it seems that it's likely to have been the sort of trigger, if not the sort of overarching reason.
And the Conservatives are 20 points behind in the polls, but the economic data projections are that things might improve a bit. Presumably they'll be saying, stick with us, the plan is starting to work. things are going to get better if you stick with us. That's going to have to be the Tory message, isn't it?
Well, it is. You heard Rishi Sunak right here when the rain was coming down and he was getting soaked by the rain, exactly laying out that case, saying, picking up on today's inflation figures, saying this was always just going to be the start, was what he was saying. This is, the beginning of starting to, change things around. Economic growth we're starting to see that. We think we're in a good position. Stick with us for security in the economy, security in a sort of broader national sense. That's certainly at the heart of Rishi Sunak's pitch that he was making. It's worth saying that from the other side, what you've been hearing, from the Labour Party is absolutely the opposite. They're saying that this is nothing to celebrate, that people have seen their income stagnate, their living standards stagnate, that 14 years of Conservative government, the question they want to put to people is, say, do you feel better off after 14 years of Conservative government? And the Labour message is, it's time for a change to deliver stability and improvements. So the competing sort of narratives, if you like, the directions that the parties are coming from, directly colliding over that ground.
Yes, PMQs was interesting, wasn't it, earlier today, because it was very strange for all sorts of reasons. But interesting that both leaders weren't taking sort of chunks out of each other. Normally, Starmer obviously would. Had Labour been given a tip-off that it was going to happen, or had they just been obviously privy to all the speculation?
I think that they very clearly knew what everyone else was speculating, or had seen what everyone was speculating about, which was that the Prime Minister might be on the brink of calling something, and Keir Starmer very, I think, deliberately stayed clear of any ground in the questions he put to the Prime Minister, any ground that gave the Prime Minister any scope for starting to electioneer, to discussing that inflation news. So Keir Starmer stuck to those questions about the inflected blood scandal and the need to, as he sees it, to get change in law that civil servants have to, and others have to be candid and tell the truth. And it's fair to say some Conservative MPs even think that there's a need for that and would like to see that happen.
And of those Conservative MPs that you have been in touch with, how much are Sunak loyalists, if there are still those that you could, define them as that in the party, and what's their reaction, and how much of the criticism of Sunak's timing is coming from all the very many other factions that we've seen, of course, build up in the Conservative Party over the last 14 years? Well,
certainly, there are, even the ones who are sceptical say, well, they can see reasons why you might want to go now. So certainly there's sort of support for that. The economic news today, yes. The idea that if you wait, you don't know what's coming, and things may well not fall the way you would want them to. There's a chance that waiting you might end up later in the year when people feel better off and feel more comfortable and might be more inclined to vote Conservative. Equally, the opposite might happen, and there could be all sorts of potential political pitfalls that might happen in the next few months. That's an argument.
That's the danger of setting a date well in advance, isn't it?
And also the danger of waiting, I think. So others saying, yes, you can see why. Go on the back of economic news. Go on the back of having got the Rwanda plan through Parliament before that's there, ready to go, and say we're ready to do this. That sort of thing.
Nadine Dorr is mischievously tweeting, as one might expect, perhaps, that is it a coincidence that the election's in July, but US school terms start in August? There's always speculation that if Rishi Sunak loses, then he'll be off to California, and he's got 2 young children at school. In the UK at the moment.
That has been going around for
a long time.
The idea that Rishi Sunak might be tempted by a job in the United States if he were to if he were to lose this election. I think it's hard to believe that might have influenced the timing of calling a national election, to be honest. But I think it's much more likely that Rishi Sunak looked at it, decided it's a gamble. It's certainly a very big gamble for a Prime Minister to take. 20-odd points behind in the polls, going now when he could have waited a few months, going now when have time for the sort of fall in inflation, potential cut or two in interest rates to sort of bed in. Everyone had thought he might be waiting for a tax cut later in the year. Again, the argument there is that, well, actually underneath some of the figures today, perhaps not quite as good as that headline looked. Everyone's focused on the headline, but underneath that, Government borrowing is, not great figures on that, which means that for the Chancellor over there next door, the scope for any more tax cuts, which many Conservatives might have been hoping for later in the year, seems to be sort of ebbing away.
Yeah.
So that would be another reason to think about going now.
And just finally, for the moment, we've got a lot of people coming and going from Downing Street at the moment. There's obviously various events going on at the moment, but Rishi Sunak came out here. He can't control the weather. Some might ask whether he can even control the political weather at the moment, the run that he's had. But it was absolutely pouring. He came out without a brolly. He was absolutely soaked. One almost felt sorry for him, to be honest. Is that the strong, vibrant, optimistic message that one might expect at the start of an election campaign?
Well, clearly, I think if you were
what's the feedback been from the Conservative MPs?
Clearly, I think if you were a Prime Minister, you wouldn't ideally choose to deliver your, big speech on the steps of Downing Street in the pouring rain. So certainly some eyebrows raised, some people saying,
could have gone inside.
Should someone have brought an umbrella, something like that? But again, I think Rishi Sunak had decided to seize this day and this moment, and that kind of necessitated then what we saw. Now, of course, people will draw conclusions they want from the sort of optics of it.
What are people saying about it? I mean, from people on his own benches.
Well, I think, to be honest,
the whole presentation, the whole sort of sense of Rishi Sunak's political judgment. He's known to be someone who's very hard-working. Many people have said that they believe that he is trying to sort of push certain things through for his own sort of valid reasoning, wherever he's coming from politically. But that question about his political judgment, his judgment in the way this was all delivered today, does that raise that again?
I think, to be honest, that's much more of an issue, or much more of something that's raised by commentators watching it, people commenting on social media who will react to the immediate image there. I think what Conservative MPs are thinking about is the sort of underlying sort of messages of the campaign, that the sort of bedrock on which it's built, and some of them worrying about that.
And do they know whether there's, which messages are likely to get traction?
Well, certainly I think we've heard them rehearsed again and again over the last few weeks and months, and again here. The sort of messages that Rishi Sunak wants to say. He's stabilised. He came in after the Boris Johnson and Liz Truss time. That he's stabilised things. That has a plan. That he's making. He's turning the economy around. That he's delivering tax cuts. So that's what he wants to do. And that then the negative message is that you shouldn't trust Labour. This would be a risk to vote for Labour. So Keir Starmer is someone who has shifted his position. So do people know what he stands for? The idea, the line that is constantly repeated by Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer doesn't have a plan. Those are going to be the themes that you're going to hear again and again and again in the election.
We will hear in a moment from Keir Starmer as well, who also responded, of course, to the announcement today. Labour have also been in campaign mode. They've had a lot of, financial and sort of growing political support. It's the momentum has built. Starmer's, as he puts it, turned around the Labour Party within 4 short years from where Corbyn left it after a massive election defeat. They did very well in the local elections. The question for Labour Party is going to be to stress to the public that, this isn't a done deal. The public now are going to see all the parties out. It is their chance to vote in July, and no vote can be taken for granted, and they want to get turnout out, don't they?
They do, and Keir Starmer and actually the Labour Party have been pretty disciplined about this, about not taking a poll lead for granted. That's polls are simply a snapshot of opinion at a point in time. They don't tell you anything about the result that we will get now on July 5th. Late on the 4th, early on the 5th, when we get the results of the election. Labour very keen to make sure they don't sound sort of triumphalist, complacent. They know that has hurt them before in previous elections. So certainly that's forefront in Labour's mind. And Keir Starmer, it's interesting, if you think back, cast your mind back to the last election, 2019, Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, it seems like an age ago. There's been a huge amount of sort of political upheaval and change since then. That election
Not
resulted...
least a different Prime Minister, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, which is partly why the Conservatives are polling as they are, isn't it? But
yes, and that election resulted in an 80-seat Conservative majority, and that's the worst share of seats that the Labour Party have had since the 1930s. That's the starting point. There have been by-election losses and defections since then, but that's the starting point
massive hill, isn't
for Labour. They know that even with a healthy poll lead, that they may well see some of that be eroded in the campaign. That they have a lot of work to do, and they have potential electoral threats too from the Green Party, from the Reform Party, taking some of those sort of traditional Labour voters, perhaps, who might have been turned to Brexit and to Boris Johnson, might now go that way. So Labour know that they have many sort of difficulties still to face as well in this. And as one Tory MP said to me, he said, I've been around, or he'd been around since, he said, back in the 1980s, 1990s. He remembered the 1992 election of John Major. He said a 12-point lead then was overcome by the Conservatives, a 12-point deficit in the polls. He said that's kind of doable, he thinks. So he said it's kind of there to play for. He wouldn't have called it now, this MP, but he thinks that, it could still happen.
All to play for. And the polling and the campaigning is about to begin, isn't it, Damien? We'll be back with you soon, but for now, thanks very much indeed. Well, let us get some more of the political reaction, starting with the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer.
Tonight, the Prime Minister has finally announced the next general election, a moment the country needs and has been waiting for, and where, by the force of our democracy, power returns to you. A chance to change for the better your future, your community, your country. Now, it will feel like a long campaign, I'm sure of that. But no matter what else is said and done, that opportunity for change is what this election is about. Over the course of the last 4 years, we've changed the Labour Party, returned it once more to the service of working people. All we ask now, humbly, is to do exactly the same for our country and return Britain to the service of working people. To that purpose, we offer 3 reasons why you should change Britain with Labour. 1, because we will stop the chaos. Look around our country. The sewage in our rivers, people waiting on trolleys in A&E, crime virtually unpunished, mortgages and food prices through the roof. It's all, every bit of it, a direct result of the Tory chaos in Westminster. Time and again, they pursue their own interests, rather than tackling the issues that affect your family. And if they get another 5 years, they will feel entitled to carry on exactly as they are. Nothing will change. A vote for Labour is a vote for stability, economic and political. A politics that treads more lightly on all our lives. A vote to stop the chaos. 2, because it's time for change. Our offer is to reset both our economy and our politics, so that they once again serve the interests of working people. We totally reject the Tory view that economic strength is somehow gifted from those at the top. Over the past 14 years, through all the crises we've had to face, sticking with that idea has left our country exposed, insecure, and unable to unlock the potential of every community. But a vote for Labour is a vote to turn the page on all that. A vote for change. And finally, 3, because we have a long-term plan to rebuild Britain. A plan that is ready to go, fully costed and fully funded. We can deliver economic stability, cut the NHS waiting times, secure our borders with a new border security command, harness great British energy to cut your bills for good, tackle antisocial behaviour, and get the teachers we need in your children's classroom. But most importantly of all, we do all this with a new spirit of service. Country first, party second. A rejection of the gesture politics you will see in this campaign, I have no doubt, from the Tories and the SNP. I'm well aware of the cynicism people hold towards politicians at the moment. But I came into politics late, having served our country as leader of the Crown Prosecution Service. And I helped the police service in Northern Ireland to gain the consent of all communities. Service of our country is the reason and the only reason why I am standing here now asking for your vote. And I believe with patience, determination, and that commitment to service, there is so much pride and potential we can unlock across our country. So here it is, the future of the country in your hands. On the 4th of July, you have the choice. And together, we can stop the chaos, we can turn the page, we can start to rebuild Britain and change our country. Thank you.
Keir Starmer, the Labour leader there, speaking a little earlier, just after Rishi Sunak confirmed and announced the date of the general election for July the 4th. And as the Prime Minister said, it is a straight contest for who is going to be walking into Downing Street. And after 14 years of Conservatives, is the country going to see a massive sea change with the Labour Party coming into power? They're ahead in the polls, but of course the polls can change. How much the campaign makes a difference is going to be the thing to watch. Well, the Liberal Democrats did do very well in the local elections. They've done very well in by-elections. They will also be hoping to take seats from the Conservatives. Here's Sir Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader.
Well, Liberal Democrats are fighting a really strong campaign across the country, and in many parts of the country it is the Liberal Democrats who can beat the Conservatives. We're the only party who can beat the Conservatives, and across the blue world. We're here in Surrey. Everyone knows the battle here is between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. So many other counties and across the home counties in the southwest of England and many other places too. If people want to get rid of the Conservative MP, they need to vote Liberal Democrat, and they can get that local champion that will stand up for that.
Well, of course, these are across all the nations, these elections, which we're going to see the campaigns roll out for. Here's the Scottish First Minister, John Swinney.
First of all, I'm very pleased that we have an election date. I'm looking forward enormously to leading my party into this election campaign. I set forward for the party leadership knowing that we'd have a Westminster election soon. It's a wee bit sooner than I think everybody thought, but it's welcome. It's a welcome opportunity to remove the Tory government and to put Scotland first. And that's what I'll be saying to the public. But I also have to say that I think this is perhaps the latest act of disrespect from a Conservative government to call an election during the Scottish summer school holidays. There will be schools in Scotland on holiday by the time polling day comes, and that will not have been given a moment's thought by the Tory election planners. It shows the contempt the Tories have for Scotland.
Well, the Greens party co-leader Carla Denyer has also been giving their reaction.
Well, the Green Party would have liked to have seen a general election before now, so we are very pleased to have an election at last. We're ready, and we think the voters are too. In places like Bristol, where I live and where I'm standing to be the next MP and the first Green MP for the city, voters are telling us that they are really distraught by the direction the Conservatives have been taking this country in over the last 14 years. But they are not feeling at all inspired by Keir Starmer's Labour Party, and so they're really excited by the opportunity to vote Green. Our manifesto, of course, will be coming out in a few weeks, but our key priorities will be around protecting the NHS from privatisation and making sure that it's properly funded, making sure everyone has access to a secure, warm, affordable home, clearing up the sewage in our rivers caused by the water companies, making sure that we tackle the cost of living crisis with practical measures that can help people right now, and of course holding the next government to account to make sure that they take ambitious climate action.
The Green Party co-leader there. Well, let's go to Scotland and speak to our correspondent there, Lorna Gordon, who is in Glasgow for us. And John Swinney, he's only just taken over the leadership. The SNP have had a very tough few months, Lorna, and now they face this huge campaign for the country.
Yeah, the SNP have been the dominant party here in Scotland for a good many years now. They won 48 out of 59 seats at the last general election. But as you say, John Swinney is their new leader. He's Scotland's new First Minister. He's only been in position for, a couple of weeks. He's got plenty in his in tray, plenty of challenges ahead by his own admission. But I think this is one challenge he didn't expect quite so soon. In those comments you heard from him, he said this was the latest act of disrespect from the Conservatives to call an election during the Scottish school holidays. He said it showed contempt by the Conservatives. And it is at the start of the Scottish school holidays, right at the start, which means that actually quite a few families are likely to be jetting away from the frankly dismal weather we've been having here in Scotland so far this spring and into the summer. But I think there's a lot to play here in Scotland in this upcoming general election. The polls suggest that Labour is ahead by 4 or 5 points. They are in the lead. It's not necessarily those numbers that count, but the distribution across the country. And there are a lot of marginal seats here, particularly across the central belt, which Labour will be targeting. So Keir Starmer has previously said that his party needs to win a considerable number of seats in Scotland at the next general election to be a legitimate party across the UK. The Scottish Conservatives have been commenting. They are calling for tactical voting in seats where they sit in second place. And the Scottish Liberal Democrats are saying that they are set to overtake the SNP at Westminster. They say there'll be more Liberals than Nationalists and that they are totally up for the fight. So it's going to be a very interesting general election campaign here in Scotland.
Absolutely, Lorna Gordon, and we know about pretty dreadful weather here too, I have to say, in Downing Street, getting progressively wetter. Let us go now to Cardiff and speak to our correspondent there, Thomas Morgan. Labour, of course, dominate in Wales, Thomas, but that means they can be held to account in the public mind, in the public vote, on their record.
Yeah, that's right, really. And already, since we've had this announcement over the past 2 hours or so, familiar arguments have been thrown from the political parties. The Welsh Labour leader, the new First Minister Vaughan Gething, saying that Welsh public are calling for a change, an end to the Tory chaos. The Tory leader here in Wales throwing it straight back, saying, well, look at the track record Welsh Labour has when it comes to education and health, the two main key devolved policy areas really that haven't gone particularly well over the last few years here. And then you've got Plaid Cymru's leader saying we're the only party they're going to fight for Wales, and the Lib Dems saying here, well, you're not going to get any difference between red and blue. But the one thing that will be different in Wales this time around, come July the 4th, is that 40 MPs will become 32. So last time around, the key battleground was in North Wales, specifically in the northeast of Wales, which was the so-called Red Walsey area. But 5 of the 6 seats that the Tories won from Labour were in North Wales. And now that the number of MPs is reducing by 8 here, it means those boundaries are changing. And the question will be, well, who does that benefit? Some political experts say that that will benefit Labour. Plaid Cymru could lose one of their 4 seats because of these boundary changes as well. Could the Lib Dems capitalise on these changes, really? And the other thing to call into question is 3 or 4 of the former and current Welsh secretaries from the Tory parties, all of their seats are potential target seats for Labour. So this could be a very interesting election really here in Wales. Even though the same old arguments may crop up from each of the parties, actually the battlegrounds may be different because of these changes to the electoral boundaries.
OK, Thomas Morgan, very interesting there too. Thank you very much. Let's cross to Belfast and speak to our Ireland correspondent, Sarah Gervin. Sarah, again, a very different political picture there. How's it going to look over the next 5 weeks?
Yeah, as always, Northern Ireland is a little bit different, and I suppose it's always argued that sometimes Northern Ireland politicians don't often agree on too much, but actually so far the reaction that we've had is they've all been quite unanimous in welcoming this general election and all saying that their party is best placed to represent Northern Ireland and people here. Now, just to recap what way it works in Northern Ireland, most of Westminster's seats are split between the two biggest parties here. So the Democratic Unionist Party has 8 seats and Sinn Féin has 7, and there are 18 seats up for grabs entirely. And just to recap on what's happening politically in Northern Ireland at the moment, the power-sharing executive, the devolved government here in Northern Ireland, has only been up and running again since earlier this year after a hiatus of 2 years. It didn't sit for 2 years. And when it came back, Sinn Féin was the biggest party and Michelle O'Neill was the First Minister for the first time. So that party will really be looking to capitalise on that and to recreate those gains and that success at Westminster. Even though Sinn Féin follows a policy of abstentionism, which means that they don't actually take their seats. And as for the DUP, well, it could really be argued that this is not great timing for them. Their former leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, stood down in March after being charged with rape and 10 other counts of historical sexual offences. Now, he's denying all of those, but we did hear from his solicitor today who said he won't be standing for re-election in Lagan Valley, so that will be one of the focus points for the general election here in Northern Ireland. Then you had the new leader of the DUP, Gavin Robinson, who was leading his party into a general election for the first time, defending his seat. So although Northern Ireland has enjoyed political stability for the past few months, there's still an awful lot of that going on, and now a general election thrown into the mix in just a few weeks, when we hope the weather will be much better than it's been today.
OK, we will leave it there. Sarah Gervin, thank you very much indeed for that in Belfast. Well, I'm joined here by Andrew Fisher, who is former Executive Director of Policy and Research for the Labour Party. Thanks for joining us. Of course, you were involved in writing the Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto. Do you support the current Labour position, their 6 key targets and their 5 missions, with a pretty changed look now under Sir Keir Starmer?
Yeah, look, I think they're important priorities that Keir Starmer set out, but at the same time, I don't think they're quite on a scale that's going to meet the inheritance that this almost certain Labour government, as certain as we ever can be, Labour government is going to inherit. We're in a deep crisis after 14 years of the Conservatives in power. We've had stagnant growth ever since the banking crash in 2008. We've had the longest and deepest cost of living crisis on record. Housing is more unaffordable than ever, whether you're a renter or somebody trying to get a mortgage or you're remortgaging even at the moment. We've got record NHS waiting lists, social care's in crisis, councils are collapsing around the country. There's sewage in our rivers and seas. It's the country's in a state, and there's a lot to be done. And I think actually when Labour gets into power, they're going to have to be a lot more ambitious than they've set out already, because the times demand it.
That, of course, requires money, and we know the economic position of the country at the moment. And Sir Keir Starmer has said these are first steps. And you have to accept that there's been a massive turnaround in public support for the Labour Party since Corbyn was ousted and Starmer took over. So he is surely in a position to justify his current position.
Well, it's not about Keir Starmer versus Jeremy Corbyn. Look, Keir Starmer will be the Prime Minister probably in a matter of months, in less than 2 months. And he's going to have to sort the problems of the UK, not have an argument internally within the Labour Party. And he's got to have a plan that's up to the task at hand. We've got record levels of child poverty. We've got rising unemployment. There are lots of other problems. I could go on. And he's got to meet those. It's not about some past debate about where the Labour Party is or was. It's about meeting the needs of people in the here and now.
Do you think when Labour, if the Labour government does come in July, that they will end up disappointing the public because they won't be able to meet all those challenges, or will they have to look again at tax? They, of course, say that they want to fund change through growing the economy.
Well, look, growth doesn't come overnight. It will take a while to turn around the economy, even if you put in the necessary investment. And we've seen Labour cut the amount of investment they say they're going to put in through their Green Prosperity Plan. So I think reality is going to have to bite at some point. I mean, you say there's less money around. I saw the Sunday Times rich list this past weekend. It said the richest 10 people in this country had expanded their wealth by tens of billions of pounds in the last year alone. The money's there, it's just in the wrong hands. And actually, we do need some redistributive taxation in this country. We've seen the water companies just today saying they need to hike bills by anything between 20% and upwards. You know, clearly people are being ripped off and they need a government that's going to stand up for them, take the money off the people that are ripping us off, and put it back in the hands of people who need it. You know, we've got record food bank use in this country. We're the 6th richest country in the world. We should not have rising child poverty, rising unemployment, and record food bank use.
And just finally, do you think those who supported Corbyn, those who are still in the Labour Party, will now go out and campaign and vote for this Labour Party?
Well, I think it's a mix, is the honest truth. You know, some people have left and gone to the Greens or gone to support independence. But look, there's one thing that Keir Starmer and his Labour leadership could do tonight that would help unify the party and encourage people to come back. And that is to restore the whip to Jeremy Corbyn and to Diane Abbott and allow them to stand, if they so wish, in the general election under a Labour banner. They've given their lives to the Labour Party and they've been treated incredibly shabbily. And people see that as a reflection on Keir Starmer's attitude towards the left of the party.
Yeah, can't see that happening certainly with Corbyn. I'm sure you would agree. But Andrew Fisher, thanks very much indeed. I'm sure we will talk again. Well, joining me now is John McTernan, a former political advisor to Tony Blair, so on the other side of the Labour Party, and Lauren McCavitt, who is a former Conservative special advisor in David Cameron's administration. Thank you both very much indeed. John McTernan, first of all, your reaction to Rishi Sunak calling the election today for July here in the rain.
I've never seen such a shambolic declaration of a general election campaign. If that's the level of preparedness that Rishi has for an election campaign, Labour are going to walk this.
Lauren McCavitt, what did you make of it?
I think I tentatively agree with John here. This did seem to be slightly rushed out. I don't know that I'm believing the line that's being briefed out at the moment that, you know, this is a slow burn for Rishi over several weeks. I'm really not certain that that's actually what went on here. I think the inflation figures that came out, while lower than, you know, they have dropped, are not low enough to guarantee rate cuts in June and July, which means that there isn't sort of an immediate good economic news story coming in the next couple of months that would have helped them to maybe have an autumn statement later in the year to go for a sort of December election. And if that's the case, then really, why are you continuing to hang on? You may as well go now. But I'm not entirely certain that this was a well thought out and long thought out plan. As I understand it, he went to the palace before, or at least he spoke to the king before he spoke to his own cabinet, which would seem to indicate that, yes, this was sort of hastily put together.
John McTernan, do you agree with that? Do you think this was a last-minute decision?
It doesn't feel like there's been any build-up to it in any way. I agree with Lauren that there isn't the sight of any good news. Maybe it's the worries about what he's getting from border force about what the summer's going to hold in terms of boats. He's not been able to stop the boats. Maybe a good summer weather will mean more people coming across. It just feels almost as if he's had enough. That Rishi Sunak personally has had enough. He's not consulted with the cabinet. He's gone to the palace. He's told them what he's done. And there wasn't there a rumour this afternoon? There were flurries of letters going to Graham Brady. You know, has he jumped or was he pushed? And it's really hard to tell. But there was no definition given to the contest by the way the Prime Minister spoke to the country. It was a very bedraggled Prime Minister who walked back into number 10. I think a very confused set of journalists watching it, political advisors watching it, and the public watching it. Because what is this election about? What's the question we're going to answer? Because unless the Conservatives have a question, this will end up being a referendum on their governments. I don't think it's looking good for them in that sense.
And Lauren, What would you say the wider political reaction has been? I don't know whether you've spoken to your old boss, David Cameron. He apparently had to fly back early from a trip overseas in order to be here today. Is the general reaction disappointment that this has come earlier than expected? Lots of speculation about an October or November date, of course.
So my former boss was David Jones, who was a Secretary of State for Wales within David Cameron's administration. So I have spoken to him, and he's obviously retiring. I think several of the retiring MPs may have thought that there was slightly longer to run. I know that Tracy Crouch was tweeting earlier that she had anticipated doing more later in the year, before an election, in the autumn, and she still had things she had to do. And there are some people like my old boss who genuinely, this was his decision to retire. This is time for him to go. I do think that there have been several retirements where they're just, afraid of what's coming and don't really want to lose their seats and want to have it be more of their decision than the electorate's. And if that's the case, then I'm sorry, you don't get to complain that you're not quite finished. You should have stayed and fought till the end if that's what you wanted, but you decided not to. So
Isn't there an element isn't there an element of, with the element of surprise, will Rishi Sunak be thinking he gets some advantage in that? Hopefully the weather will be better. He'll be able to say, look, inflation has come down. There is the potential of better economic news ahead, better energy bills and so on. That's clearly going to be part of his message. So isn't there some logic in going now?
Looking at his announcement, the weather can't exactly be worse. I think from the point of view of reform and from the SNP's point of view, I don't think that this was a good announcement for them. The SNP with a newly minted leader and some really quite bad stuff that's been going up in the SNP administration up in Scotland, they certainly won't be happy. I think that probably says really good things for Labour in Scotland. I think they've got a really good chance of unseating quite a few up there. I think reform are slipping in the polls. Nigel Farage obviously hasn't made a decision about is he in, is he out, is he going to come back, is he going to run it? And this sort of takes them by surprise too. So it's conceivable that from the point of view of the political machinations between each party, that yes, this going by surprise now when most people were thinking that it was going to be the autumn, that there could be some benefit there. I think John is right. I think we are heading for a bad summer in terms of illegal immigration across the Channel. I think we were already looking at really large numbers of legal migrants within the United Kingdom, and that's beginning to really filter through into how people feel the government is performing. They've been having all these arguments in the last week about university visas, graduate visas, and right to work after graduation visas. And I think that this is something that is going to be a big issue on the doorstep for us in this election campaign. And this is not something that we get to blame on anybody else. You can't say, oh, well, Labour left it no money in 2010. It doesn't work like that anymore. This is our record. We absolutely have to stand by it. There are a lot more people migrating legally into this country than there have been in years. And a lot of people are not going to be happy about that. And that's going to come out on the doorstep.
Yeah, immigration obviously going to be an issue. John McTernan, for the Labour Party and for the Labour leadership, there are questions, aren't there? Andrew Fisher referred to them in terms of whether their plans are ambitious enough, whether all their policy areas are really thought through enough if they do get into government. When those policy areas and the shadow cabinet members are really interrogated now, as they will be, are they actually ready? Are they up to it?
Yeah, they're totally ready. They were ready for a May 2nd election. So Labour has been, it's had extra months now since May the 2nd. Well, a month, still more months till June, July the 4th. Look, Labour are ready. They've been ready.
But are they actually being ambitious enough in what they want to achieve?
Look, we're going to inherit a wrecked economy, a broken Britain, a country that needs rebuilding. Labour has to be absolutely clear what it can do, what it will do. And over a 10-year period, the 2 terms of a Labour government, I think we'll be able to make major changes. But you have to be honest with the public. The Tories have wrecked the country, and it cannot be rebuilt in a moment. It's going to take years to restore some of the things that we need to rebuild and restore. And I think being honest and leveling with the country is critical. I think it fits with Keir Starmer. He's not a guy for overblown ambitions, not a guy for overblown claims. we'll make some big changes. The big changes in Great British Energy, the big changes in decarbonising the economy, the big changes in renationalising the railway, the big changes in new rights for workers. Those are big and bold plans, but they've all got to be done with the fact that, the government have borrowed massively. 2/3 of their tax cuts in the last two fiscal events have been financed by borrowing. So there's a huge burden there, and hopefully we'll turn the corner quickly.
OK, John McTernan and Lauren McKevitt, thank you both very much indeed for joining us. Well, I'm joined now by Jonathan Rednals, who's Shadow Secretary of State for Business and for Trade. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Are you ready, and is Labour being honest with the public about how it's going to fund tackling the huge problems that it says it's going to face?
Well, the answer is yes, and yes again. So, look, this is an election where the British people will get the chance to vote for change. If they're happy with things under the Conservative Party, that's what the offer from those people will be. But if they want change, if they want something better, it's to Labour they can look. And we can say that with confidence, first of all, because we've had the humility to change ourselves. If we had kept on the direction we were on in 2019, I don't think we'd be competitive in this election. But you saw just last week when Keir Starmer laid out our first 6 steps that we would take in government, not just the actions we would take to make the difference initially, what would we do first of all, but how we would pay for those things, and also answer the question, to be frank, which I know a lot of people will have tonight, which is there is so much wrong in their own community, so much wrong around them in the UK. How can any political party seek to make a difference? Well, it's through those practical first steps that we'll seek to do that. And of course, wherever we've got a pledge, so the 6,500 extra teachers pledge is funded by raising taxes on private education, VAT and business rates. If it is, for instance, setting up GB Energy, a state-owned energy company, to bring down bills for the long term, that will be funded by a slightly higher windfall tax on the oil and gas industry. So in each of our pledges, you've got a very specific set of steps to take and how we would pay for those things.
Those who've looked at the numbers say that the amount that you're going to raise from those steps is minuscule compared with the actual challenges that the country faces just over the next 5 years, let alone a 10-year plan, as Keir Starmer talks about. Again, isn't the question really about honesty from all the parties in terms of how much tax people should pay and what you can actually do to solve these enormous, deep-seated and long-term challenges?
Look, I think you're right to say people have a sense that there is so much going wrong. I mean, frankly, what works better today in the UK than when the Conservative Party came to power in 2010? So the reason we set out those first steps was to show people that practical, deliverable actions can be taken, that they can be funded and supported. Of course, they are just first steps. They're not the scale of our ambitions. We want to renew this country. We want the chance to put it on a fundamentally better and different path. But we know when the problems are so great, people want to know, well, how can you practically make a difference to those things? So, for instance, again, if we were to look at the 40,000 additional NHS procedures every week under a Labour government, we would change the rules the government have slightly stolen from us on the non-dom tax policy and in how taxes are collected, and we'd specifically use that money to deliver that pledge. So we want to be able to show people we can make a real difference as soon as possible to their lives. And of course have a whole range of pledges in the long term, building 1.5 million homes over the course of a Labour government's first term in Parliament, things that would make that long-term difference. But also we know we've got to punch through that cynicism, give people hope, show the practical difference we can make early on and how we would pay for that.
Jonathan Reynolds, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Well, joining me now is Lucy Fisher, a Whitehall editor from the Financial Times, and Sonia Soda, chief leader writer at The Observer. Thank you both for joining us. Lucy, you tweeted a few days ago that there was, potential talk about an election being called today. You were right. I got a bit of a tip myself yesterday also, but there's been so much speculation. Can you tell us any more about how sure you were that it was going to be called today?
Well, look, I shouldn't overplay it. What I got wind of last week was that last Monday of last week, Tory party bosses at Conservative campaign headquarters had got together to discuss the financing plans for a potential snap July election. They talked about what budget the party would have left. The instruction was given to the pen holders on key relationships with mega donors to try and discreetly inquire as to the likelihood of them being able to give large donations at short notice. And since then, I've picked up chatter about the events and visits team at Downing Street going into overdrive, a flurry of activity in recent days, talking to Tory sympathetic businesses about their willingness to hand over their sites, their factories, their offices for events in coming weeks. So all these factors were really fueling the speculation, which reached fever pitch this morning in Westminster. But look, I think the decision was obviously kept very close in Number 10, and that's evidenced by the fact that, key cabinet ministers, David Cameron had to cut short a visit to Albania today, where he was meeting the Albanian PM, and dash back to be briefed by Sunak this afternoon. Grant Shapps only this morning learned that he had to delay a planned trip to the Baltics in order to attend this cabinet meeting. So it really was a very small number of, people who were in on this decision, which I think the final call was made only very late on.
Yeah, I mean, Lucy, I guess it always has to be, doesn't it? Otherwise, it's so easy for these things to leak. Sonia Soda, Labour, of course, say that they've been ready. They were expecting a potential May election, but they are really going to come under scrutiny like they have never faced until now. Keir Starmer is going to be grilled as a potential future inhabitant of Downing Street.
I mean, they will. Scrutiny of the opposition party and the man who wants to be Prime Minister will always hot up, I think, during a general election campaign. And there's going to be more focus on Labour's policy than there ever has before. But I mean, I think Labour are feeling quite confident. I mean, they wouldn't want that to be known. But going into this general election campaign, you've had Labour's campaign chief, Morgan McSweeney. He's been warning shadow cabinet ministers, other than the party, for months that an early general election could be on the way. There has been a great deal of work going on behind the scenes, not only around that pledge card that we saw launched last week, but around what's going to be in the Labour manifesto, and a very clear message from Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves so far that nothing is going in that manifesto that costs money unless it's been, fully costed.
Do you think all the shadow cabinet members are equally prepared with actual policy plans, ready to hit the ground running if they were to be elected? Are they being ambitious in terms of how much money they're going to have to raise to tackle all these problems?
Well, I think, Labour has played it quite cautiously so far, and we should expect that to continue. It's been quite a risk-averse election strategy in the sense that Labour don't want to commit to anything that distracts from the fact that they say their main mission is around stability and achieving economic stability, and that is the way to growth, that's the way to higher tax revenues. So that is a message that they really want to send. So it would be you're not going to see loads of really snazzy, costly pledges coming from Labour. It's going to be very different to the 2019 general election campaign.
And Lucy Fisher and Sonia Soda, sorry, we're out of time, but thank you both very much indeed. Well, we're getting lots of reaction, of course, hearing, of course, of some surprise and disappointment, especially on the Tory benches, who perhaps thought they might have a bit more time, hoping for better economic news. There has been good inflation data. Rishi Sunak has chosen to make his announcement on the back of those figures. Some asking whether really has he effectively given up, because they are 20 points behind in the polls. But there is all to play for now, as the public will see all the political parties out campaigning in force with a vote in July. This is BBC News.